She hit the ground hard, tasting dirt and her own failure. The baby screamed against her chest while her other two children stood frozen behind her, waiting for a miracle she couldn't give them. Hannah Rowe had knocked on 17 doors in this godforsaken town, begging, not for money, just work, and every single one had slammed shut. No food, no shelter. No plan left except to keep walking until her body quit. And now, beneath this oak tree in the middle of nowhere, it finally had. The wagon wheel she heard approaching could mean rescue or ruin. She was too broken to tell which she hoped for more. If you want to see how far this story of survival and second chances reaches, hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. Now let me take you back to where it all began. The sun had no mercy that day. It bore down on the dry Texas road like a hammer on an anvil, turning the air thick and hostile. Hannah Rowe stumbled forward, one foot dragging after the other, her worn boots kicking up small clouds of dust that settled on her already filthy skirt. The baby, Ben, barely 8 months old, whimpered against her shoulder, his tiny fists clutching the fabric of her dress. Behind her, Nate and Lily followed in silence, their shadows stretched long and thin across the cracked earth. Nate was 10, old enough to understand that his mother was breaking, but too young to know how to fix it. His sister Lily, just turned 7, had stopped asking questions 2 days ago. Now she only held his hand and kept walking. Hannah's lips were cracked and bleeding. Her throat burned with every shallow breath. She'd finished the last of their water that morning, giving most of it to the children, and now even swallowing hurt. But thirst wasn't the worst of it. The worst of it was the shame. She had begged. Not once. Not twice. 17 times in the town of Flat Creek, population maybe 300 if you counted the drunks sleeping it off in the alleys. She'd gone door to door, hat literally in hand, asking, pleading, for work. Any work. She could cook, clean, mend clothes, keep books, tend animals. She wasn't asking for charity. She was offering labor in exchange for food and a roof. Every door had closed. The general store owner had looked her up and down with cold eyes and said, I got no use for a widow with babies hanging off her skirts. The saloon keeper had laughed outright. What are you going to do, darling? Serve drinks with a baby on your hip? Even the boarding house matron, a woman who should have understood, had shaken her head and muttered something about propriety and not that kind of establishment. The church had been her last hope. She'd climbed those wooden steps with her heart in her throat, Ben heavy in her arms, Nate and Lily trailing behind like lost lambs. The Reverend had opened the door himself, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Reverend, Hannah had begun, her voice shaking. My name is Hannah Rowe. My husband died 3 months back. I've got 3 children and no family nearby. I'm not asking for handouts. I can work. I can... Sister Rowe, he'd interrupted gently, but his hand was already on the door. We run a lean operation here. The congregation barely keeps us afloat as it is. I wish I could help, but please. The word had torn out of her, raw and desperate. I just need a chance. I'll scrub floors, I'll wash linens, anything. The Reverend's smile had faltered, just for a moment, and she'd seen it, pity mixed with discomfort. The look of a man who wanted her gone so he wouldn't have to feel bad about it. I'll pray for you, he'd said, and shut the door. Hannah had stood there for a long moment, staring at the peeling paint, feeling something inside her crack wide open. Then Nate had tugged her sleeve and whispered, Mama, let's go. And she'd turned away before the Reverend could see her cry. That had been 4 hours ago. Since then, she'd walked. West, because west was away from Flat Creek and the faces that had turned from her. West, because if she kept moving, maybe she wouldn't have to think about what came next. West, because stopping meant admitting she had failed. But her body had other ideas. The world tilted suddenly, and Hannah's knees buckled. She caught herself on one hand, the other arm locked around Ben, who started to wail in earnest now. The ground was hot and hard beneath her palm. Her vision swam. Mama! Lily's voice high and frightened. Nate was at her side in an instant, his small hands gripping her arm. Mama, get up, please get up. Hannah wanted to. She tried, but her legs were trembling, her head spinning, and the baby's cries were drilling into her skull. She'd given him the last of her milk that morning, and even that had been thin and unsatisfying. He was hungry. They were all hungry, and she had nothing left to give them. I'm trying, she whispered, but the words came out broken. There was an oak tree ahead, maybe 20 yards off the road, its branches offering a small patch of shade. If she could just make it there, she could rest. Just for a minute. Just long enough to think. Nate seemed to read her mind. Come on, Lily, help me. Together, the children half carried, half dragged their mother to the tree. Hannah collapsed against the trunk, pulling Ben close, while Nate and Lily sank down beside her. Nobody spoke. There was nothing to say. Hannah closed her eyes and let herself admit the truth she'd been running from all day. She had no plan, no money, no prospects. She'd left Flat Creek because staying meant watching her children starve in front of people who didn't care. But leaving hadn't solved anything. It had only made her alone. What kind of mother are you? The voice in her head sounded like her late husband's mother, Evelyn, sharp and judgmental, the voice that had blamed Hannah for Robert's death, even though a horse kick was nobody's fault. You can't even feed your own children. You're pathetic. Maybe she was. Ben's cries softened into exhausted whimpers. Lily leaned against Hannah's shoulder, her eyes half closed. Nate sat rigid and watchful, his jaw set in a way that made him look older than 10. He was trying to be the man of the family now, and the weight of it was already crushing him. I'm sorry, Hannah whispered. I'm so sorry. Nate didn't answer. He just reached over and squeezed her hand. The sun continued its slow descent, turning the sky a brutal, beautiful orange. Hannah's mind drifted. She thought about Robert, his laugh, his strong hands, the way he used to swing Lily in circles until she shrieked with joy. He'd been a good man, a simple man, a ranch hand with big dreams and no money to back them up. They'd been happy anyway, or at least happy enough, and then one stupid accident had ripped it all away. She thought about Evelyn's letter, the one that had arrived 2 weeks after the funeral. It had been cold and formal, offering to take the children off her hands so Hannah could start fresh. As if her babies were burdens to be discarded. As if starting fresh meant erasing the only pieces of Robert she had left. Hannah had burned that letter. But now, sitting under this tree with her children hollow-eyed and silent, she wondered if Evelyn had been right. Maybe they would be better off without her. Maybe... The sound of wagon wheels cut through her spiraling thoughts. Hannah's eyes snapped open. Her heart kicked into a panicked rhythm. Someone was coming. Nate heard it too. He scrambled to his feet, stepping in front of his mother and sisters, his hands balled into fists. Mama! Shh! Hannah shifted Ben to one arm and pushed herself upright, her legs shaking. Stay behind me. The wagon came into view slowly, pulled by 2 sturdy horses. The driver was a man, alone from what she could see, and he was slowing down. Hannah's mind raced through possibilities. Bandits didn't usually travel in wagons, but desperate men did desperate things, and a woman with children was easy prey. She glanced around for anything she could use as a weapon and saw only rocks and sticks. The wagon stopped about 10 feet away. The man climbed down with the careful movements of someone who'd spent a lifetime working with his body. He was tall, broad-shouldered, maybe in his early 40s, with sun-darkened skin and a scar that ran from his right eyebrow to his cheek. His clothes were plain but clean. Work clothes, not traveler's clothes. He wore a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face, but his eyes were visible, and they were studying her with an intensity that made Hannah's skin prickle. "Evening," he said. His voice was low and rough, like gravel underfoot. Hannah lifted her chin, trying to summon some semblance of dignity, even though she was filthy, exhausted, and clearly desperate. "Evening." The man's gaze swept over the scene, the mother, the crying baby, the 2 frightened children, the single tree in the middle of nowhere. His expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes, not pity, something else. "You folks broke down?" he asked. "No." Hannah's voice came out steadier than she felt. "We're just resting. Resting." He repeated the word like he was testing it. His eyes dropped to her empty hands, her worn-out boots, the baby's thin blanket. Out here, in the middle of nowhere. Hannah's jaw tightened. She didn't owe this stranger an explanation. "We're fine. Thank you for stopping." It was a dismissal, but the man didn't move. He just stood there, his arms loose at his sides, watching her with that unreadable expression. Nate shifted his weight, and Hannah felt him tense. Her son had picked up a rock at some point, a decent-sized one. He was holding it low, out of sight, but ready. The man noticed. Of course he did. His gaze flicked to Nate, then back to Hannah. Your boy's got good instincts, he said quietly. Can't fault him for that. We don't want any trouble, Hannah said, hating how thin her voice sounded now. Neither do I. The man took off his hat, running a hand through dark hair streaked with gray. Name's Silas Mercer. Got a ranch about 8 miles west of here. I was in Flat Creek picking up supplies. He paused, his eyes narrowing slightly. Saw you there earlier, talking to Reverend Wallace. Hannah's stomach dropped. He'd seen her begging. He knew. I wasn't spying, Silas added, as if reading her thoughts. Just happened to be across the street. Hard not to notice when a man shuts his door on a woman with babies. Shame flooded through Hannah, hot and suffocating. She wanted to disappear. She wanted to scream at this man for witnessing her humiliation. Instead, she just stood there holding her baby, trying not to break. Silas put his hat back on. I've got water in the wagon, he said. And some bread. Kids look thirsty. Hannah's pride reared up instinctively. We don't need... When's the last time they ate? The question was blunt, almost harsh, and it cut through her defenses like a knife. That's none of your business, Hannah said, but her voice wavered. When? Silas pressed, and there was something in his tone. Not cruelty, not even impatience, but a kind of relentless insistence that demanded truth. Hannah's throat closed up. She looked at Nate, at Lily, at baby Ben with his tear-streaked face. Yesterday morning, she whispered. Silas nodded once, like she'd confirmed something he already knew. He turned and walked back to the wagon without another word. Hannah's heart hammered. Was he leaving? Had she offended him? But Silas didn't climb into the driver's seat. Instead, he reached into the back and pulled out a canteen and a cloth-wrapped bundle. He walked back to the tree and set them down on the ground, a few feet from Hannah, then stepped back. It's just water and bread, he said. Nothing fancy, but it's yours if you want it. Hannah stared at the canteen. Her mouth was so dry it hurt. Lily was looking at the bundle with wide, desperate eyes. Why? Hannah asked. It came out harsher than she intended. Why would you do that? Silas regarded her for a long moment. Because I got more than I need, he said simply. And you got less. It wasn't an answer that made sense in the world Hannah had been living in, the world of closed doors and turned backs. But the canteen was real, and the bread was real, and her children were starving. She bent down slowly, picked up the canteen, uncapped it, and handed it to Nate. Small sips, she said, her voice shaking. Not too fast. Nate drank, then passed it to Lily, who drank and passed it to her mother. Hannah wet her cracked lips, let a little water soothe her burning throat, then took the canteen to Ben, dipping her finger in the water and letting him suck on it. The baby latched on eagerly, his eyes fluttering with relief. Silas watched in silence. He didn't smile. He didn't offer platitudes. He just stood there, a solid presence in the fading light. Hannah unwrapped the bread next. Thick slices, still soft. She broke off pieces for Nate and Lily, who devoured them like they were afraid it might vanish. She gave Ben a tiny bit to gum on, then allowed herself one small bite. It was the best thing she'd ever tasted. When the bread was gone, Hannah folded the cloth carefully, her hands trembling. Thank you, she managed. The words felt inadequate. Silas nodded. Then he said, You got a place to go tonight? Hannah's stomach twisted. We'll manage. That's not what I asked. She met his eyes, and for the first time she saw something there that wasn't judgment or pity. It was recognition. Like he knew what it meant to be stranded in the middle of nowhere with no good options. No, she said quietly. We don't. Silas shifted his weight, considering. I could use some help on the ranch, he said after a moment. Lost my housekeeper last month. Place is a mess. Could use someone who can cook, keep things organized, maybe help with mending and such. Hannah's heart stuttered. Was he offering her a job? It's not charity, Silas continued, as if anticipating her objection. It's work. Hard work. You'd earn your keep, room and board for you and the kids, plus a small wage when I can manage it. No questions asked about where you came from or why. Hannah stared at him. This had to be a trick. Men didn't just offer jobs to desperate widows out of the goodness of their hearts. There had to be a catch. "What do you want in return, Yeek?" she asked bluntly. Silas's expression didn't change. "I want someone who'll show up and do the work," he said. "That's all." "And if I can't?" Hannah challenged. "If I'm not good enough? If the baby keeps me up all night and I can't get the work done?" "Then we'll figure it out." Silas's voice was calm, steady. "I'm not looking for perfect. I'm looking for reliable." Hannah wanted to believe him. She wanted to so badly it hurt. But trust was a luxury she couldn't afford. "Why us?" she asked. "Why not hire someone from town, someone without complications?" Silas was quiet for a moment, his gaze drifting to the horizon where the sun was sinking fast. "I know what it's like," he said finally, "to need a second chance and not get one. Figured maybe I could be different." The honesty in his voice was startling. Hannah searched his face for deception, for hidden motives, for anything that would tell her this was a mistake, but all she saw was a tired man offering a tired woman a way out. "I can cook," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I can clean. I can mend and keep books and work until I drop. I won't steal from you. I won't cause trouble. And I'll make sure my children don't either." "Good enough," Silas said. "I need to know something first." Hannah squared her shoulders, fighting to keep her voice steady. Are you a decent man?" It was a blunt, dangerous question. If Silas was offended, he could take back the offer. He could leave them here. But Hannah had to know. She had to protect her children. Silas held her gaze. "I've made mistakes," he said slowly. "Done things I'm not proud of. But I don't hurt people who don't deserve it, and I don't prey on women and children. That's the truth." Hannah studied him. The scar on his face, the calluses on his hands, the weariness in his eyes. She thought about her options. Sleep under this tree tonight, hope they didn't freeze or get attacked by animals. Then try to make it to the next town on foot with no food and no water. Or take a chance on this stranger who'd fed her children and offered them shelter. It wasn't really a choice at all. "All right," she said. "We'll come." Silas nodded. He didn't smile, didn't offer his hand, didn't make a show of it. He just turned and walked to the wagon. "Let's get moving before dark," he said. "Road gets tricky after sunset." Hannah gathered her children, holding Ben against her chest while Nate and Lily pressed close to her sides. They walked to the wagon together, a small, fragile unit held together by desperation and hope. Silas helped them up into the back, where there were crates and supplies and a couple of old blankets. It wasn't comfortable, but it was infinitely better than the hard ground. Nate climbed in first, then turned to help Lily. Hannah handed Ben up to Nate, then pulled herself into the wagon with the last reserves of her strength. Silas climbed into the driver's seat and snapped the reins. The horses started forward with a jolt, and the wagon began to roll west. Hannah settled into the corner, Ben in her lap, Nate and Lily on either side of her. The sun was almost gone now, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold. The air was cooling, and for the first time in days, Hannah felt something other than panic. She didn't know if this was safety. She didn't know if Silas Mercer was truly a good man or just a good liar. But she knew her children were out of the sun, they had water in their bellies, and they were moving toward something instead of running from everything. Nate leaned against her shoulder. "Mama," he whispered, "are we going to be okay?" Hannah looked down at her son, her brave, scared, too-grown-up boy, and kissed the top of his head. "I don't know," she said honestly, "but we're going to try." The wagon rattled on through the twilight, carrying a widow and her children toward an uncertain future. Behind them, the oak tree stood alone in the fading light, a silent witness to the moment when everything changed. And ahead, somewhere in the gathering dark, a ranch waited, offering either salvation or another kind of trap. Hannah closed her eyes and held her children close. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The ranch appeared as a collection of dark shapes against the starlit sky. Low buildings, fences, the silhouette of a barn. Silas brought the wagon to a stop in front of a small cabin, set the brake, and climbed down. "This is it," he said, his voice cutting through the night sounds, crickets, a distant owl, the soft snorting of the horses. Hannah peered out from the wagon bed. The cabin looked modest but solid, with a covered porch and shuttered windows. Smoke curled from the chimney, suggesting someone had banked a fire earlier. Silas came around to the back of the wagon and lowered the gate. "Let me help you down." Hannah handed Ben to him first, a gesture of trust that didn't escape either of them. Silas took the baby carefully, holding him with the awkward competence of someone who'd handled children before, but not recently. Ben blinked up at him with solemn eyes, too tired to fuss. Nate and Lily jumped down on their own. Then Hannah climbed out, her legs stiff and aching. She took Ben back from Silas, and he led them to the cabin. Inside, it was simple but clean. A main room with a fireplace, a table and chairs, a worn sofa. A narrow hallway led to what Hannah assumed were bedrooms. The fire in the hearth had burned down to embers, but the room still held warmth. Silas lit a lantern, casting yellow light across the space. "Kitchen's through there," he said, pointing to a doorway. "2 bedrooms down the hall. You and the kids can take the one on the left. I'll sleep in the other." Hannah nodded, trying to take it all in. It was overwhelming, the kindness, the shelter, the sudden shift from desperation to relative safety. "There's a pump out back for water," Silas continued. "Outhouse is past the chicken coop. I'll show you everything in the morning. For now, just rest." "Thank you," Hannah said again, and this time the words felt heavier, more real. Silas shrugged. "We'll see how you feel after a week of hard work." He moved toward the door, then paused. "I'm an early riser. Breakfast is at dawn. If you can manage to cook something, that'd be appreciated. If not, we'll figure it out." He left before Hannah could respond, closing the door quietly behind him. Hannah stood in the middle of the cabin, holding her sleeping baby, her 2 older children swaying with exhaustion beside her. The silence was thick and strange. For the first time in months, she wasn't afraid of the next 5 minutes. "Come on," she whispered to Nate and Lily. "Let's find our room." The bedroom was small, a double bed with a faded quilt, a dresser with a cracked mirror, a single window overlooking the dark land beyond. It smelled faintly of cedar and dust. Hannah laid Ben down in the center of the bed, then helped Nate and Lily climb in on either side of him. They were asleep in seconds. Hannah sat on the edge of the bed, watching her children breathe. In the lantern light, their faces looked softer, younger. Nate's furrowed brow had relaxed. Lily's mouth was slightly open, her hand curled under her cheek. Ben's tiny chest rose and fell in a steady rhythm. They were safe. For tonight, at least, they were safe. Hannah let herself cry then, quietly, so she wouldn't wake them. Tears of relief, exhaustion, fear, and something that might have been hope. She cried until there was nothing left, and then she lay down beside her children, pulled the quilt over them all, and closed her eyes. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Tomorrow she would have to prove herself, earn her place, navigate the complicated reality of living under a stranger's roof. But tomorrow was still hours away. Tonight she was warm. Her children were fed. And for the first time since Robert died, Hannah Rowe allowed herself to sleep without fear. Outside, the Texas night stretched wide and endless. Somewhere in the darkness, Silas Mercer sat on the porch of the barn, smoking a hand-rolled cigarette and staring at the cabin where the light had just gone out. He didn't know what he just brought into his life. A desperate widow and 3 hungry kids. It could be a disaster. It probably would be. But as he stubbed out his cigarette and headed to his own bed in the small room he'd carved out of the barn's loft, Silas thought about the look in Hannah Rowe's eyes when she'd asked if he was a decent man. Like she'd been ready to fight him if the answer was no. Like she'd been ready to protect her children with her bare hands if necessary. He respected that. The world was full of people who gave up when things got hard. But Hannah Rowe hadn't given up. She'd walked into the desert with her babies and kept going until her body quit. That was the kind of stubborn strength a person couldn't fake. Silas lay down on his narrow cot and laced his fingers behind his head, staring up at the rough wooden beams overhead. Maybe this would work. Maybe it wouldn't. Either way, he'd given them a chance. And sometimes that was all anyone really needed. Hannah woke to the sound of a rooster crowing and the realization that she had no idea what time it was. Pale gray light filtered through the window, suggesting dawn or something close to it. She sat up carefully, trying not to disturb the children, and looked around the unfamiliar room. For a disorienting moment, she couldn't remember where she was. Then it came back. The wagon, the stranger, the offer of work. She pressed her hand to her chest, feeling her heart beat too fast. This was real. They were actually here, on a ranch owned by a man she'd met less than 12 hours ago. Ben stirred beside her, making soft grunting sounds that meant he'd be fully awake and demanding attention in about 30 seconds. Hannah scooped him up before he could wake the others and carried him out into the main room. The cabin was cold. The fire had died completely overnight, leaving only ash in the hearth. Hannah stood there holding her baby, looking around at the shadowy kitchen doorway, the closed front door, the windows with their simple curtains. She had no idea what Silas expected from her, no idea where anything was, no idea how to start. But she'd promised to cook breakfast, and Dawn was here. Hannah found the kitchen by feel, pushing through the doorway into a narrow room with a cast-iron stove, a dry sink, open shelves stocked with basic supplies, and a small table pushed against one wall. It was cleaner than she'd expected, but clearly the domain of someone who cooked only out of necessity, not skill or pleasure. She laid Ben on a folded blanket on the floor. He immediately protested and set about building a fire in the stove. The wood was stacked neatly beside it, and there were matches in a tin on the shelf. Her hands shook as she struck the first match, but the kindling caught, and soon she had a decent flame going. Ben's protests escalated to full crying. Hannah picked him up, jostled him on her hip, and began searching the shelves one-handed for something to make. Flour, salt, a tin of lard, some dried beans, a few wrinkled potatoes, coffee. Not much, but enough for a simple breakfast if she was creative. She was measuring flour into a bowl, Ben still fussing against her shoulder, when the front door opened and Silas walked in. He looked exactly as he had the night before. Work clothes, scarred face, quiet intensity, but in the morning light Hannah could see more details. The gray in his hair was more pronounced than she'd realized. His hands were scarred too, not just his face. He moved with the careful economy of someone who'd learned not to waste energy on unnecessary motion. "You're up," he said, stating the obvious. "You said dawn," Hannah replied, trying to sound more confident than she felt. "I'm making biscuits and coffee. There's not much else unless you want beans for breakfast." Silas shrugged out of his coat and hung it on a peg by the door. "Biscuits are fine. I usually just have coffee and whatever's left from the night before." He paused, looking at her. "You need help with the baby?" The offer surprised her. "I can manage." "Didn't ask if you could. Asked if you needed help." Hannah hesitated, then nodded. "If you could just hold him for a minute while I get these in the oven, that'd be useful." Silas crossed the room and took Ben with the same careful competence he'd shown the night before. The baby stopped crying immediately, startled by the change. Silas held him against his chest, one large hand supporting Ben's back, and just stood there, looking mildly uncomfortable, but not incompetent. Hannah worked quickly, cutting the lard into the flour, adding just enough water to make a shaggy dough, then pressing it out and cutting rough circles. She slid the pan into the oven and straightened, wiping her hands on her skirt. "Thank you," she said, taking Ben back. The baby had fallen asleep against Silas's shoulder, which seemed impossible given how much he'd been crying 30 seconds earlier. "He's worn out," Silas observed. "Probably been crying for days." "He has," Hannah admitted. "He's hungry all the time, and I don't have enough milk anymore." Silas nodded slowly. "There's a cow in the barn. She's old, but she still gives. I'll show you how to milk her after breakfast. Baby can have some of that." Relief washed through Hannah so powerfully it made her dizzy. Thank you, that would help." They stood there awkwardly for a moment, the kitchen filling with the smell of baking biscuits. Then Silas cleared his throat. I'll be outside. Holler when it's ready." He left, and Hannah let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. 20 minutes later, she called him back in. Nate and Lily had woken up and were sitting at the table, wide-eyed and silent, taking in their new surroundings. Hannah had set out plates, poured coffee for herself and Silas, and put the biscuits in the center of the table with a small pot of honey she'd found in the back of the cupboard. Silas sat down without ceremony and took a biscuit. He split it open, drizzled honey inside, and took a bite. Hannah watched anxiously, waiting for judgment. "It's good," he said after a moment. "Better than anything I've made in 6 months." It was the closest thing to praise she'd gotten in a long time, and Hannah felt something loosen in her chest. "Thank you." Nate and Lily were still staring at Silas like he might turn into a wolf at any moment. He noticed and addressed them directly for the first time. "You're Nate, right?" he said to the boy. Nate nodded warily. "And you're Lily?" Another nod, this one from the girl. "Good names," Silas said. "I'm Silas. This is my ranch. Your mama's going to be working here, which means you'll be living here too for a while. You got questions? You can ask. But if I'm working, you wait till I'm done. Understood?" "Yes, sir," Nate said quietly. "Don't need the sir," Silas replied. "Just Silas is fine." He turned his attention back to his coffee. "You kids old enough to help with chores?" "I can do chores," Nate said quickly. "I'm strong." "I can feed chickens," Lily added, her voice barely audible. "Good. I'll find things for you to do. But for the first few days, just stay close to the cabin and don't wander. There's coyotes, sometimes snakes. I don't need to be scraping anyone off the property because they didn't listen." The bluntness should have been harsh, but somehow it wasn't. It was just honest. Hannah appreciated that more than she could say. They ate in relative silence, the tension gradually easing as the food disappeared. When the meal was done, Silas pushed back from the table and stood. "All right," he said. "Let me show you around." The ranch was small by Texas standards, maybe 100 acres, Silas explained as they walked, with about 30 head of cattle, a dozen chickens, 2 horses, and the milk cow. He ran it alone, which meant things got done slowly, and some things didn't get done at all. "I'm not rich," he said flatly, as they stood near the barn, surveying the property in the morning light. "I'm not even comfortable. This place keeps me fed and pays the taxes, but that's about it. So if you're expecting luxury, you're in the wrong place." Hannah looked at the sturdy barn, the functional fences, the well-maintained equipment. "I'm not expecting luxury," she said. "I'm expecting work." Silas grunted in approval. "Good, because there's plenty of that." He showed her the cow, a placid brown creature named Bess, and taught her how to milk, his hands guiding hers until she got the rhythm. The milk came in warm, white streams, filling the bucket with a sound that was oddly soothing. Ben watched from his blanket nearby, and when Hannah was done, Silas poured some of the fresh milk into a cup and showed her how to feed it to the baby, using a clean cloth as a makeshift nipple. Ben sucked eagerly, his small hands clutching at the cloth, and for the first time in weeks he seemed truly satisfied. Silas showed her the chicken coop next, where Lily immediately took over, scattering feed with serious concentration. He showed her the vegetable garden, currently overrun with weeds, and the smokehouse, and the small shed where he kept tools. He explained the daily routine: animals fed at dawn, milking before breakfast, midday check on the cattle, evening feeding, milking again before supper. "You'll handle the cabin, the cooking, the garden when it's planted, the chickens, and the milking," Silas said. "I'll handle the cattle, the horses, the heavy repairs, and anything that requires going into town. We split the rest as needed." "What about the children?" Hannah asked. "What about them? Do you want them out of the way, kept quiet?" Silas looked at her like she'd asked something strange. "They're kids. They make noise. As long as they're not breaking things or getting in the way of dangerous work, I don't care what they do." It was such a simple answer, but it made Hannah want to cry again. She swallowed hard and nodded. The first week was brutal. Hannah woke before dawn each day, built the fire, made breakfast, cleaned up, milked Bess, tended the chickens, washed clothes, scrubbed floors, mended torn shirts, weeded the garden, made lunch, did more laundry, started dinner, milked Bess again, fed everyone, cleaned up, collapsed into bed, and then did it all over again. Her hands blistered, then calloused. Her back ached constantly. Ben still woke 3 times a night, and Lily had nightmares that left her sobbing and clinging to Hannah in the dark. Nate tried to help with everything, working himself to exhaustion because he thought he had to prove they deserved to stay. But slowly, things began to settle into a rhythm. Silas was a man of few words, but he was consistent. He woke at the same time every day, did his work without complaint, and expected the same from everyone else. He didn't hover or micromanage. He didn't criticize unless something was actually wrong. And when Hannah burned the dinner on the 3rd night, distracted by Ben's crying and Lily's questions, he just ate it anyway and said, "Better luck tomorrow." The children adjusted faster than Hannah expected. Nate started following Silas around during the day, watching how he mended fences and handled the horses. Silas didn't tell him to leave, just warned him once about staying clear of the cattle's back hooves, and then let him observe in silence. Lily claimed the chickens as her personal responsibility and talked to them like they were her friends. Hannah would hear her out in the yard, chattering away to the hens about her day, her voice bright and surprisingly happy. Even Ben seemed to thrive. The regular milk made him plumper, less fretful. He started smiling, real, gummy smiles that made Hannah's heart ache with relief. And Hannah herself began to remember what it felt like to be useful. She'd forgotten, in those terrible months after Robert's death, that she was good at things. Good with her hands, good at organizing, good at making something out of nothing. The cabin transformed under her care, cleaner, more organized, with wildflowers on the table and curtains that actually closed properly. The meals improved as she learned what Silas liked and what ingredients were available. She even started a small herb garden near the kitchen door, planting seeds she'd found in a forgotten packet on the shelf. Silas noticed. He didn't say much, but Hannah could tell. He started eating slower, like he was actually tasting the food. He stopped sleeping in the barn loft and moved into the second bedroom properly. He fixed the squeaky hinge on the kitchen door that had been driving Hannah crazy. Small things. Quiet acknowledgments that they were becoming something like a household. 3 weeks in, Hannah was hanging laundry on the line when Nate came running from the pasture, his face pale. "Mama, Mama, come quick!" Hannah dropped the shirt she was holding and ran, her heart in her throat. "What happened? Are you hurt?" "Not me. Silas. One of the cows is stuck in the creek bed, and he went down to get it out, and I think he's hurt." Hannah didn't think. She just grabbed Lily, shoved both children toward the cabin, and told them, "Stay here with Ben. Don't move." Then she ran. She found Silas at the creek, which was more of a dry gulch this time of year, about half a mile from the house. He was on the ground, his leg twisted at a bad angle, and a large cow was standing a few feet away looking annoyed. "Damn fool animal stepped right into a hole," Silas said through gritted teeth when he saw Hannah. "I went down to get her out, and the bank gave way." Hannah scrambled down into the gulch, loose dirt sliding under her feet. "Can you stand?" "Not without help." She got her shoulder under his arm and heaved. Silas was heavy, all muscle and bone, and his sharp intake of breath told her the movement hurt. But together they managed to get him upright and out of the gulch. "Can you walk?" Hannah asked. "Not well." His face was pale, jaw clenched. "Lean on me." It took them 20 minutes to make it back to the cabin. Silas limping heavily, Hannah supporting as much of his weight as she could. By the time they reached the porch, her shoulders were screaming and Silas was sweating despite the cool air. She got him inside and into a chair, then knelt to examine his leg. His boot was already swelling. "I need to get this off," she said. Silas nodded tightly. "Do it." Hannah unlaced the boot as gently as she could, but there was no way to make it painless. Silas hissed through his teeth, but didn't cry out. When the boot finally came free, Hannah could see the ankle was badly swollen and already turning purple. "I think it's sprained," she said. "Maybe worse. You need a doctor." "No doctor," Silas said immediately. Silas, nearest doctor is in Flat Creek. That's a half-day ride, and I can't afford it anyway. It'll heal on its own." Hannah wanted to argue, but she knew he was right about the money. Instead, she said, "Then we do this my way. You stay off it completely for at least 3 days. I'll wrap it, ice it with water from the well, and you don't argue." Silas looked at her, really looked at her, and something shifted in his expression. "Yes, ma'am," he said quietly. Hannah wrapped his ankle with strips of cloth, elevated it on a stack of blankets, and brought him cold compresses throughout the day. She also took over his chores, which meant she was now doing everything: milking Bess, feeding the animals, checking on the cattle, hauling water, cooking, cleaning, watching the children. It was impossible, but Hannah did it anyway. Nate helped as much as a 10-year-old could, and even Lily pitched in, fetching things and keeping Ben entertained. Silas sat in his chair, fuming with frustration and uselessness, and watched Hannah work herself ragged. On the second day, he said, "You don't have to do all this." Hannah looked up from the bread dough she was kneading, her hair falling out of its bun, her dress streaked with flour and dirt. Yes, I do. I could manage. No, you couldn't. And if you make it worse trying, then we're all in trouble. So sit still and let me do this. Silas shut his mouth and sat still. On the evening of the third day, Hannah finished the chores, fed everyone dinner, put the children to bed, and then sat down at the table across from Silas with a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. Your ankle looks better, she said. Feels better too, Silas admitted. You did good. Hannah shrugged, too tired to respond properly. They sat in silence for a while, the only sound the crackling of the fire. Then Silas said, I was wrong about you. Hannah's head came up. What? When I picked you up on that road, I thought you'd last maybe a week. Figured you'd realize how hard the work was and leave, or you'd get scared being out here alone with me and run off in the night. I was wrong. Hannah didn't know what to say to that. You're tougher than you look, Silas continued. Tougher than most men I know, actually. And you're a good mother. Your kids are good kids because you raised them right. Something hot and painful swelled in Hannah's chest. Thank you, she whispered. Silas nodded once, then stood carefully, testing his weight on the injured ankle. He winced but stayed upright. I'm going to bed. Tomorrow I'll be back to work. Silas, half days, he conceded. Light work, but I can't sit around anymore. Hannah knew better than to argue. Half days, she agreed. He limped toward his bedroom, then paused at the doorway. Hannah? Yes? You've earned your place here. I want you to know that. You're not charity. You're not a burden. You're part of this now, if you want to be. Hannah's throat closed up. She managed a nod, unable to speak. Silas disappeared into his room, and Hannah sat alone in the firelight, letting his words sink in. You're part of this now. For the first time since Robert died, Hannah felt like she might actually survive this. More than survive, she might build something new. The fourth week brought new challenges. Silas announced they needed to go into town for supplies, flour, sugar, coffee, nails, a few other essentials. Hannah's stomach clenched at the thought of facing Flat Creek again, but they had no choice. They loaded the wagon early one Saturday morning, all 5 of them, and made the long ride into town. Hannah kept her head down as they rolled down the main street, acutely aware of the stares. People recognized her, the desperate widow who'd begged for work. And now here she was, riding into town with Silas Mercer and her children like she belonged. The whispers started immediately. Hannah caught fragments as they walked to the general store. Living out there with him. Shameful. Those poor children. Her face burned, but she kept walking, Ben in her arms, Nate and Lily close to her sides. Silas walked slightly ahead, his expression dark. He heard the whispers too, and Hannah could see the tension in his shoulders. They made it into the store, and the proprietor, the same man who'd turned Hannah away a month ago, greeted Silas with false friendliness. Mercer, good to see you. What can I get for you today? Usual supplies, Silas said curtly. He handed over a list. The proprietor's eyes slid to Hannah. I see you've got help now. I do, Silas said. His tone warned against further comment. The proprietor wisely didn't push it. He filled the order while Hannah and the children waited near the door, trying to be invisible. They were loading the wagon when a woman approached. She was middle-aged, well-dressed, with a pinched expression that spoke of permanent disapproval. Mr. Mercer, she said loudly enough for half the street to hear, I'm surprised to see you bringing that woman into town. Aren't you concerned about your reputation? Silas stopped, a sack of flour in his hands. Mrs. Patterson, he said evenly, I'm not concerned about my reputation, no. Are you concerned about yours? Mrs. Patterson blinked. I beg your pardon? Just wondering if you're proud of yourself. Gossiping about a widow trying to feed her children. Seems like an interesting way to spend your Saturday. The woman's face flushed red. Well, I never... No, you probably haven't, Silas agreed. Never been desperate enough to need help, never been hungry enough to swallow your pride. Must be nice. He turned his back on her and continued loading the wagon. Mrs. Patterson stood there, sputtering, then turned on her heel and marched away. Hannah stared at Silas, something fierce and grateful burning in her chest. He caught her eye. "Get in the wagon," he said quietly. "We're done here." They rode out of town in silence, but this time the silence felt different, protective almost. Hannah realized that Silas had just publicly claimed her as part of his household, defended her against gossip, and made it clear he didn't care what anyone thought. It should have been nothing, but to Hannah, it was everything. That night, after the children were asleep, Hannah found Silas sitting on the porch, smoking one of his rare cigarettes. "Can I talk to you?" she asked. "Sure." She sat down on the step beside him, careful to leave space between them. "Thank you for what you did today, in town." Silas shrugged. "People talk. Let them. It'll make things harder for you." "Things have been hard before." He took a drag from the cigarette, the ember glowing in the dark. "I don't care what they think, Hannah, and you shouldn't either." Easier said than done. Maybe, but it's the truth. He was quiet for a moment, then said, "You planning to stay?" The question caught her off guard. "What?" "Here, on the ranch. You planning to stay, or is this just temporary until you figure out something better?" Hannah thought about it, really thought about it. A month ago, she would have said this was temporary, just a stopgap until she could find something more stable, more respectable. But now, sitting on this porch in the dark, listening to the night sounds of the ranch, she realized she didn't want to leave. "I'd like to stay," she said softly, "if you'll have us." Silas nodded slowly. "Good, because I was starting to get used to having you around." It was the closest thing to sentimentality she'd ever heard from him, and it made her smile. "I'm starting to get used to being around," she admitted. They sat together in comfortable silence until the cigarette burned down to nothing, and then they went inside to sleep, both of them carrying the quiet knowledge that something had shifted between them, something that felt a lot like trust. The next morning, Silas left before dawn. Hannah woke to find a note on the kitchen table written in rough handwriting. "Cattle Drive, back in 3 days. You'll be fine." She stood there holding the note, her heart pounding. He'd left her alone, alone with the children, alone on the ranch, alone to manage everything. Either he trusted her completely or he was testing her. Hannah decided it didn't matter which. She'd manage either way. The first day went smoothly. She stuck to the routine, kept the children close, and didn't let herself think about everything that could go wrong. The second day was harder. One of the horses seemed off, limping slightly, and Hannah had no idea if it was serious. She checked its hooves, found nothing obvious, and decided to keep it stabled and watch it. The third day, everything fell apart. It was close to midnight when Hannah heard it, the sound of hoofbeats approaching fast, followed by men's voices, rough and loud. Her blood turned to ice. She grabbed the rifle Silas kept above the door. She'd seen where he stored it but never touched it, and moved to the window. 3 riders were approaching the cabin, silhouettes in the moonlight. Nate appeared at her side, his face white. "Mama?" "Wake your sister and get in the bedroom with Ben," Hannah said, her voice deadly calm. "Lock the door. Don't come out until I say." "Mama?" "Now, Nate." He ran. The riders stopped outside. Hannah heard them dismounting, heard their boots on the porch steps. Then someone pounded on the door. "Open up! We know Mercer's got supplies in there." Hannah's hands were shaking, but her voice was steady when she called back. "Mr. Mercer isn't here, and you're trespassing. Leave now or I'll shoot." Laughter. Ugly, mocking laughter. "You hear that, boys? The lady's gonna shoot us." The door handle rattled. Someone was trying to force it open. Hannah raised the rifle, aimed it at the door, and fired a shot into the ceiling. The sound was deafening in the small cabin. Silence fell outside. "Next one goes through the door," Hannah said, her voice like iron. "And I don't miss." More silence. Then one of the men spoke, his voice different now, wary. "You're bluffing." "Try me." She heard them conferring in low voices. Then the sound of boots retreating, horses being mounted. Within seconds, they were riding away into the night. Hannah stood frozen, the rifle still raised, until she couldn't hear the hoofbeats anymore. Then her legs gave out and she sank to the floor, shaking so violently her teeth chattered. The bedroom door opened. Nate ran to her, Lily right behind him. "Mama, Mama, are you okay?" Hannah pulled them close, the rifle clattering to the floor beside her. I'm okay, we're okay, they're gone. She held her children and cried. From fear, from relief, from the sheer overwhelming terror of what had almost happened. When Silas rode in the next afternoon, Hannah was in the yard scrubbing laundry with vicious intensity, trying to work the fear out of her system. He took one look at her face and knew something was wrong. What happened? Hannah told him. All of it. The riders, the threats, the rifle shot, the long night of sitting awake with the gun across her lap, waiting for them to come back. Silas's expression went dark and dangerous. You know any of them? No, too dark to see faces. He was quiet for a long moment, his jaw working. Then he said, You did good. Hannah's head snapped up. What? You protected yourself and the kids. You didn't panic. You didn't give in. You did exactly right. He paused. But I shouldn't have left you alone. That was stupid. You had work to do. Work can wait. You're more important. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Neither of them was quite ready to examine. Hannah looked at this scarred, quiet man who had given her shelter and work, and now apparently priority over his own livelihood. What are we doing here, Silas? She asked quietly. What do you mean? This, us, is this just an arrangement? Or is it something else? Silas met her eyes. I don't know, he said honestly. But I know I don't want you to leave, and I know I'd kill anyone who tried to hurt you or those kids. If that means something, then I guess it's something else. Hannah's breath caught. It wasn't poetry, it wasn't romance, but it was real, and it was more than she'd dared to hope for. Okay, she whispered. Okay? Okay, it's something else. Silas nodded slowly, something like relief crossing his face. Good. He turned to walk toward the barn, then stopped. Hannah? Yes? Thank you. For not running, for staying, for fighting. Where else would I go? She said softly. Silas smiled, a rare, genuine smile that transformed his whole face. Nowhere, I hope. And for the first time, Hannah believed him. The weeks that followed settled into something Hannah had almost forgotten existed, routine tinged with contentment. She rose each morning before the sun, built fires that chased away the Texas chill, and made coffee strong enough to wake the dead. Silas would appear like clockwork, exchange a few quiet words about the day's work, and then disappear into the demands of the ranch. The children thrived in ways that made Hannah's chest ache with relief. Nate had stopped looking over his shoulder constantly, waiting for disaster. Lily sang to the chickens every morning, her voice bright and fearless. Even Ben had started pulling himself up on furniture, determined to walk before his first birthday. Hannah found herself humming while she worked, caught herself smiling at nothing in particular. The cabin had become a home, the ranch had become theirs, and Silas had become something she didn't quite have words for yet. 2 months after the night riders had come, Hannah was in the garden pulling weeds when she heard a wagon approaching. Her heart kicked into a familiar rhythm of anxiety, but when she looked up, she recognized the driver, Tom Bradley, who ran the feed store in Flat Creek and had always been decent to Silas. Mrs. Rowe, Tom called out, tipping his hat as he pulled up near the cabin. Is Silas around? Out mending the north fence, Hannah replied, wiping dirt from her hands. Should be back within the hour. Can I help you with something? Tom climbed down from the wagon, his expression uncomfortable. Actually, I came to give you a warning, both of you, really. Hannah's stomach tightened. What kind of warning? There's been talk in town about you living out here with Silas, unmarried. Normally, I'd say let people gossip themselves hoarse, but this is different. Tom pulled off his hat, turning it in his hands. Your late husband's mother arrived in Flat Creek 3 days ago, Evelyn Rowe. She's staying at the boarding house, and she's been asking questions. A lot of questions. The name hit Hannah like a physical blow. She actually stepped backward, her hand going to her throat. Evelyn is here? You know her then. She's Robert's mother. I haven't seen her since the funeral. Hannah's voice came out thin and strained. What kind of questions is she asking? Tom's discomfort deepened. About your living situation, about the children, about whether they're being properly cared for. She's been talking to the reverend, the doctor, even the sheriff. And she brought a lawyer with her from Austin. Hannah felt the blood drain from her face. A lawyer. I don't know what she's planning, but it's not friendly. I thought you should know. The world tilted dangerously. Hannah gripped the garden fence to steady herself. Thank you for telling me, Tom. I appreciate it. Tom nodded, clearly relieved to have delivered his message. Silas is a good man. Whatever that woman's planning, don't let her make you doubt that. He climbed back into his wagon. You need anything? You send word. Hannah watched him drive away, her mind racing. Evelyn was here, with a lawyer, asking questions about the children. She knew exactly what that meant. Silas found her an hour later, still standing in the garden, staring at nothing. He took one look at her face and crossed the distance between them in 3 long strides. What happened? Hannah told him about Tom's visit, about Evelyn, about the lawyer. With each word, Silas's expression grew darker. She can't take them, Hannah said, and her voice broke on the words. She can't. I won't let her. She won't, Silas said firmly. You're their mother. I'm a widow living on a man's ranch with no legal claim to anything. She's wealthy, respectable, with a big house in Austin, and servants, and everything children supposedly need. Hannah's hands were shaking now. She wanted them after Robert died. She wrote me a letter offering to take them off my hands. I thought she'd given up when I didn't answer, but she hasn't. She's been planning this. Silas was quiet for a long moment, his jaw working. Then he said, We need to go to town, talk to someone who knows the law. I can't afford a lawyer. I can. Hannah stared at him. Silas, I've got money saved. Not much, but enough for this. We're going to fight her, Hannah, whatever it takes. The fierceness in his voice made something in Hannah's chest crack open. Why? She whispered. Why would you do that for us? Silas looked at her like the answer was obvious. Because you're mine to protect now, you and those kids. That's how this works. Hannah wanted to argue with the possessive language, wanted to insist she could fight her own battles, but the truth was simpler and more desperate. She needed him. She couldn't do this alone. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me yet. Let's see what we're up against first. They rode into Flat Creek the next morning, leaving the children with a neighbor woman Silas trusted. Hannah wore her best dress, which wasn't saying much, and tried to keep her spine straight despite the terror clawing at her insides. The lawyer's office was above the general store, a cramped room with a desk buried under papers and law books. The lawyer himself was a thin man named Marcus Webb, maybe 50 years old, with wire-rimmed glasses and ink-stained fingers. Mr. Mercer, he greeted them, shaking Silas's hand. And you must be Mrs. Rowe. Please, sit. They sat. Hannah's hands were clenched so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had gone white. Webb listened carefully as Hannah explained the situation. Robert's death, Evelyn's initial letter, Hannah's desperate months of survival, finding work with Silas, and now Evelyn's sudden appearance with a lawyer in tow. When Hannah finished, Webb sat back in his chair and steepled his fingers. I'll be honest with you, Mrs. Rowe. Your situation is precarious. Hannah's heart sank. You're unmarried, living in a home with a man who's not your husband or family member. You have no independent income, no property of your own. Mrs. Evelyn Rowe, on the other hand, is a widow of means with an established household. In the eyes of the court, she could make a compelling argument that the children would be better off in her care. She didn't want them when I was starving, Hannah said, her voice shaking with anger. She didn't offer help. She offered to take them away from me. There's a difference. I understand, and I agree with you morally, but the law doesn't always align with what's right. It aligns with what's provable and what serves the best interests of the children, as the court defines it. So what can we do? Silas asked, his voice tight. Webb was quiet for a moment, considering. Then he said, There is one solution that would make Mrs. Rowe's position significantly stronger. What is it? Hannah asked. Marriage. The word hung in the air like a gunshot. If you and Mr. Mercer were married, Webb continued, you'd be living in a legitimate household with a stable provider. The optics would be entirely different. A court would be much less likely to remove children from a married couple's home, especially if there's no evidence of abuse or neglect. Hannah felt her face go hot. She couldn't look at Silas. I'm not suggesting a marriage of convenience would be easy, Webb added quickly. But legally speaking, it would give you the strongest possible position. Silas spoke, his voice carefully neutral. How much time do we have? I'd estimate Mrs. Evelyn Rowe will file her petition within the week. Once she does, there will be a hearing. You'd want to be in the strongest position possible before that happens. So we'd need to marry quickly, Silas said. Ideally, yes. Hannah finally found her voice. This is insane. We barely know each other. We've been living together for 2 months. It's not romantic, Silas finished for her, but it's practical. Hannah turned to look at him, searching his face for any sign of what he was thinking. His expression was unreadable, as always, but there was something in his eyes, something serious, and maybe a little sad. Can we talk about this privately? Hannah asked. Webb nodded. Of course. Take all the time you need. I'll be downstairs. He left, closing the door behind him. The silence in the room was deafening. Hannah stood and walked to the window, looking down at the dusty street below. Her mind was spinning, trying to process what was being asked of her. You don't have to do this, Silas said quietly. There might be other ways to fight her. Webb doesn't think so, and he's the lawyer. Still, marriage it's permanent. It's not something to rush into. Hannah laughed, but it came out bitter. I don't have the luxury of taking my time, Silas. If Evelyn gets those children, I'll never see them again. She'll cut me out completely. I know her. Then we fight her another way. How? Hannah turned to face him. With what? I have no money, no property, no standing in this community. All I have is you. And apparently that's not enough unless we make it legal. Silas stood, his movements careful. I don't want you to marry me because you're trapped. He stopped, his jaw working. Hell, I don't know what I want, but I know that's not it. Hannah studied him. This man who'd fed her children when they were starving, who'd given her work when no one else would, who'd defended her in town and stood guard over her safety. She thought about the way he'd looked at her when she'd survived the night riders, the quiet respect in his voice when he said she was tough. She thought about mornings in the kitchen and evenings on the porch, and the slow, steady build of something that felt like trust. It wasn't love. Not yet. But it was real. What if I said I wanted to? Hannah asked softly. Silas's head came up. What? What if I said I wanted to marry you? Not because I'm trapped, but because... She swallowed hard. Because I think we could make this work. Really work. Not just as an arrangement, but as a real marriage. Hannah, I'm not saying I love you. I'm not even saying I know what this is between us. But I trust you, Silas. I trust you with my life and my children's lives. And that's more than a lot of people have when they get married. Silas crossed the room to stand in front of her. Up close, she could see the lines around his eyes, the gray in his hair, the scar that she'd stopped noticing weeks ago. If we do this, he said, his voice rough, I'm doing it right. Not some quick ceremony to fool a judge. I'm asking you properly, and you're saying yes because you mean it, not because you're scared. Hannah's breath caught. Silas, and I'm telling you right now, if you marry me, I'm going to do everything in my power to make you happy. Not because I have to, but because I want to. Because somewhere along the way, you and those kids stopped being charity and started being family, and I protect my family. Tears stung Hannah's eyes. That's the most words I've ever heard you say at once. A small smile tugged at Silas's mouth. It's important. Yes, Hannah said. It is. They stood there, close enough to touch, but not touching, the weight of the decision settling around them like a promise. So, Silas said finally, will you marry me, Hannah Rowe? Not because a lawyer says you should, but because you're choosing to? Hannah thought about everything she'd lost. Robert, her home, her security, her innocence about how cruel the world could be. She thought about everything she'd found, this ranch, this life, this man who'd seen her at her absolute worst and hadn't turned away. Yes, she said. I'll marry you. Silas let out a breath like he'd been holding it for hours. Okay then. Okay then, Hannah echoed. And just like that, everything changed again. They were married 3 days later in the small church in Flat Creek, the same church whose reverend had turned Hannah away months before. The irony wasn't lost on her. Reverend Wallace performed the ceremony with a thinly veiled disapproval that made Hannah want to walk out. But Silas stood solid beside her, his hand warm and steady when he took hers, and she focused on that instead of the Reverend's judgmental eyes. Nate stood as Silas's witness, serious and proud in a shirt Hannah had pressed that morning. Lily held baby Ben and tried not to fidget. Tom Bradley and his wife were the only other guests, serving as official witnesses to make everything legal. The ceremony was short and perfunctory. Reverend Wallace rushed through the vows like he couldn't wait to be done. When he pronounced them man and wife, there was no kiss, no celebration, just a curt nod and papers to sign. Hannah signed her name, Hannah Mercer now, and felt the weight of it settle into her bones. They were walking out of the church when Hannah saw her. Evelyn Rose stood across the street, dressed in expensive black silk, her silver hair pulled back severely, her face a mask of cold fury. Hannah stopped dead. Silas followed her gaze and his hand moved to the small of her back, a protective gesture that didn't go unnoticed. Evelyn crossed the street with deliberate steps, her cane tapping against the wooden planks. She stopped a few feet away and looked Hannah up and down with withering contempt. "I see you've wasted no time making yourself respectable," Evelyn said, her voice dripping with disdain. "Mrs. Rowe," Hannah said, forcing her voice to stay level, "I didn't expect to see you here." "I'm sure you didn't. A secret wedding to avoid scrutiny. How convenient." "It wasn't secret," Silas said, his voice hard. "We followed the law. Got married in a church with witnesses. There's nothing inappropriate about it." Evelyn's cold eyes shifted to Silas. "And you must be the rancher who's been harboring my daughter-in-law and grandchildren. How noble of you. I gave them work and a home when no one else would, including you." The barb hit its mark. Evelyn's expression tightened. "I offered to care for the children properly, in a home befitting their station. Hannah refused out of selfish pride." "You offered to take them away from their mother," Hannah shot back, her control slipping. "That's not care. That's cruelty." "Cruelty?" Evelyn's voice rose. "I'll tell you what's cruel. Dragging 3 innocent children into poverty, making them work like servants on some failing ranch, exposing them to the gossip and scandal of your choices." "They're fed," Hannah said fiercely. "They're safe, they're loved. That's more than you ever offered." "Love doesn't put food on the table, or ensure their education, or guarantee their future. Money doesn't guarantee happiness." Evelyn smiled, and it was a terrible thing to see. "Perhaps not, but it does guarantee legal representation. I've filed a petition with the court for custody of Nathan, Lillian, and Benjamin. The hearing is set for 2 weeks from today." Hannah's world tilted. "You can't." "I can, and I have. We'll see what a judge thinks about your sudden convenient marriage and your suitability as a mother." Evelyn looked at Silas again. "And we'll see if your new husband's reputation can withstand proper scrutiny." "What's that supposed to mean?" Silas asked, his voice dangerous. "It means I've done my research, Mr. Mercer. I know about your past. I know about the men you killed in New Mexico. I know about the trial, and the questions that were never fully answered." Evelyn's smile widened. "Do you really think a judge will allow children to be raised by a man with blood on his hands?" Hannah felt Silas stiffen beside her. She looked at him, but his face had gone carefully blank. "That was self-defense, and the court ruled in my favor," Silas said flatly. "The court couldn't prove otherwise. That's not the same thing." Evelyn adjusted her grip on her cane. "I'll see you both in court, and when this is over, those children will finally have the life they deserve, far away from this disaster you've created." She turned and walked away, her back straight and proud. Hannah stood frozen, her mind reeling. Silas had killed people? There had been a trial. Why hadn't he told her? "Hannah," Silas started. "Not here," she said quietly, aware of the townspeople watching from windows and doorways. "Let's go home." The ride back to the ranch was silent and tense. The children sensed something was wrong and stayed quiet in the back of the wagon. When they finally arrived, Hannah asked Nate to take his siblings inside while she talked to Silas. They stood in the yard, the afternoon sun beating down, neither of them quite able to look at the other. "You should have told me," Hannah said finally. "I know." "You should have told me before I married you." "I know." "Did you kill those men?" Silas was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Yes." Hannah's stomach dropped. "Why?" "Because they were going to kill me and my brother. We were working a ranch in New Mexico, moving cattle through disputed territory. 5 men jumped us at night. They shot my brother before we even knew they were there. I fought back. When it was over, 3 of them were dead and my brother was dying in my arms." His voice was flat, emotionless, like he was reciting facts instead of describing a nightmare. "The law got involved," Silas continued. "There was a trial. The evidence supported self-defense, but there were questions. The men I killed were connected to someone powerful. There was pressure to convict me anyway. In the end, the judge ruled in my favor, but only barely. I left New Mexico the next day and never went back." Hannah absorbed this, trying to reconcile the quiet man she knew with the violence he was describing. "How long ago was this?" 12 years. "And you've been running from it ever since?" "Not running, just not advertising it." Silas finally looked at her. "I'm not proud of what happened, but I'm not ashamed either. I did what I had to do to survive, that's all." Hannah thought about the night riders, about how she'd fired the rifle without hesitation when her children were threatened. She thought about the steel she'd found in herself when desperation demanded it. "I understand," she said quietly. Silas blinked. "What?" "I said I understand. You protected yourself and your brother. You did what you had to do." Hannah stepped closer. "What I don't understand is why you didn't tell me before. Because I was afraid you'd look at me differently. Like I'm some kind of monster." "Are you?" "No. But I've done monstrous things when I had no choice." Hannah reached out and took his hand. His fingers were rough and warm, and they closed around hers like a lifeline. "We've all got things in our past we're not proud of," she said. "I've lied, stolen food when I was desperate, nearly let my pride kill my children rather than admit I needed help. None of us are saints, Silas. We're just people trying to survive." "Evelyn's going to use this against us in court." "I know." "She might win." Hannah's throat tightened. "I know that too." They stood there holding hands in the yard, the enormity of what they were facing pressing down on them like a physical weight. "I'm sorry," Silas said. "I should have told you. You deserve to know what you were marrying into." "Yes, I did. But I'm not sorry I married you." Hannah squeezed his hand. "We're going to fight this, Silas. Together. And we're going to win." "How can you be so sure?" "Because I have to be. Because the alternative is losing my children, and I won't let that happen." Silas looked at her, really looked at her, and something shifted in his expression. "You're the strongest person I've ever met," he said quietly. "I'm terrified." "I know, but you're still standing. That's what strength looks like." Hannah wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe they had a chance. But Evelyn's words kept echoing in her head. "We'll see what a judge thinks about your sudden convenient marriage and your suitability as a mother." That night, after the children were asleep, Hannah sat at the kitchen table with Silas and Marcus Webb, who'd ridden out from town to discuss strategy. "The timing of the marriage is going to be a problem," Webb said bluntly. "Evelyn's lawyer will argue it was a calculated move to avoid scrutiny, not a legitimate union." "It is legitimate," Hannah said. "I believe you, but we need to prove it to a judge who's going to be looking for any excuse to side with a wealthy, established widow over a struggling rancher and his new wife." "So what do we do?" Silas asked. Webb pulled out a sheet of paper covered in notes. "We build a case showing that the children are thriving in your care. We get testimony from neighbors, from Tom Bradley, from anyone who's seen the family together. We document the improvements in the children's health since they came to live here. We show that this is a stable, loving home." "And my past?" Silas asked. "We address it head on. We don't hide it or make excuses. We present the facts of the trial, the judge's ruling, and the 12 years of lawful living you've done since then. We make it clear that you're not a danger to the children." Hannah's hands were clenched in her lap. "Will it be enough?" Webb's expression was grim. "I don't know. Evelyn Rowe has money and connections. She can make this very difficult, but we have something she doesn't have." "What's that?" "The truth. And sometimes, if we're lucky, that matters." The 2 weeks before the hearing passed in a blur of preparation and anxiety. Webb came by several times to prepare Hannah and Silas for questioning. He drilled them on their stories, on dates and details, on how to present themselves to the judge. "Don't get emotional," he warned Hannah. "I know that's hard, but judges don't respond well to tears. Be calm, be factual, be strong." "What if I can't?" Hannah asked. "Then fake it. This is a performance, Mrs. Mercer. Your children's lives depend on how well you play the part." The words chilled her, but she knew he was right. The night before the hearing, Hannah couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, the bed she now shared with Silas, though they kept to their respective sides and hadn't yet crossed that particular bridge, and stared at the ceiling, her mind racing with everything that could go wrong. "You awake?" Silas's voice came from the darkness beside her. "Yes." "Me too." They lay in silence for a moment. Then Silas said, "Whatever happens tomorrow, I want you to know something." "What?" "I meant what I said when I married you, about protecting you and the kids, about making you happy. That wasn't just words to satisfy a judge. I meant it." Hannah felt tears sting her eyes. "I know you did. And if the worst happens, if the judge rules against us, we don't give up. We fight, we appeal, we do whatever it takes. Even if it costs everything you have?" Even then. Hannah rolled onto her side to face him. In the darkness, she could just make out the shape of his profile, the line of his jaw, the breadth of his shoulders. "Why?" she whispered. "Why are you willing to risk so much for us?" Silas was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Because I was alone for a long time before you came. And now that I'm not, I don't ever want to be again." It was the most honest, vulnerable thing he'd ever said to her. Hannah reached out in the darkness and found his hand. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" "For giving me a reason to keep fighting." Silas's fingers tightened around hers. "You never needed me for that. But I'm glad I could help anyway." They fell asleep like that, hands clasped in the darkness, holding on to each other against whatever the morning would bring. The courthouse in Flat Creek was a modest building, but it felt massive and intimidating as Hannah climbed the steps the next day. She wore her wedding dress, the only nice thing she owned, and had pulled her hair back severely to look as respectable as possible. Silas walked beside her in his best shirt, freshly shaved, his expression grim and determined. Inside, the courtroom was already filling up. Evelyn sat at the front with her lawyer, a polished man in an expensive suit who looked like he ate small-town lawyers for breakfast. Tom Bradley was there, along with a few other neighbors who'd agreed to testify on Hannah's behalf. And in the back, barely visible, sat Nate, Lily, and Ben, with the neighbor woman who was watching them. Hannah's heart clenched when she saw her children. Nate gave her a small, brave smile. Lily waved. Ben, oblivious to the gravity of the situation, gurgled happily. The judge entered, an older man named Horace Sullivan with white hair and a stern expression. Everyone stood until he took his seat. "Be seated," Judge Sullivan said. His voice was gravelly and tired, like he'd heard every story there was to hear and wasn't impressed by any of them. "We're here to consider a petition for custody filed by Mrs. Evelyn Rowe regarding the minor children. Nathan, Lillian, and Benjamin Rowe, currently residing with their mother, Hannah Mercer, and her husband, Silas Mercer. Let's begin." Evelyn's lawyer stood smoothly. "Your Honor, we'll demonstrate that while Mrs. Mercer loves her children, she lacks the means and stability to provide for them adequately. We'll show that this recent marriage was a calculated attempt to appear respectable rather than a genuine union, and will present evidence that Mr. Mercer's violent past makes him unsuitable as a guardian for young children." Hannah's hands clenched in her lap. Silas's jaw tightened. Webb stood in response. "Your Honor, we'll prove that the Mercer household is stable, loving, and more than adequate for raising healthy, happy children. We'll show that this marriage, while recent, is legitimate and built on mutual respect and commitment, and we'll demonstrate that Mr. Mercer's past, while regrettable, does not reflect his current character or pose any danger to the children." Judge Sullivan nodded. "Very well, let's hear the evidence. Mrs. Rowe's counsel, you may begin." And with that, the battle for Hannah's children officially began. Evelyn's lawyer called his first witness within minutes. Dr. Edmund Price, a silver-haired physician from Austin who'd never examined Hannah's children but had examined them years ago when Robert was still alive, took the stand with practiced ease. Dr. Price, the lawyer began, you treated the Rowe children when they lived in Austin, correct? Yes, when their father was employed at the Harrison estate. I saw them for routine visits. And in your professional opinion, what kind of environment is optimal for raising healthy children? Webb shot to his feet. Objection, Your Honor. The witness hasn't examined the children in over a year. He has no knowledge of their current condition. Overruled, Judge Sullivan said. The witness may answer as to general medical opinion. Dr. Price settled back in his chair. Children require stability, proper nutrition, access to medical care, and a clean, safe environment. They also benefit from educational opportunities and social interaction with peers. And would you say a remote ranch, 8 miles from town, provides these things adequately? That would depend on the specific circumstances. Let me be more specific then. Would a ranch with limited financial resources, run by a man with no experience raising children, where the nearest doctor is a half-day's journey away, meet the standard of care you'd recommend? Webb stood again. Your Honor, this is speculation. The witness has no direct knowledge. I'll allow it, the judge interrupted. Answer the question, Dr. Price. The doctor looked uncomfortable, but answered. Such circumstances would present challenges, certainly. Medical emergencies would be concerning. Access to education would be limited. Thank you, Doctor. Evelyn's lawyer turned to the judge with satisfaction. No further questions. Webb approached for cross-examination, his expression sharp. Doctor Price, you mentioned medical emergencies. Are you aware that Mrs. Mercer successfully treated Mr. Mercer's severe ankle sprain without medical intervention? I was not aware of that. Are you aware that the children have gained weight since moving to the ranch, that their color has improved, that they show no signs of illness or malnutrition? I have not examined them recently, so no. So your testimony about their current health is based on what exactly? Assumption? Dr. Price shifted in his seat. I'm speaking to general standards of care. General standards, not these specific children, not this specific situation. Webb let that hang in the air. No further questions. Hannah watched the doctor leave the stand, her stomach churning. One witness down, and already she could feel how this would go. Death by 1,000 careful cuts, each one designed to make her look inadequate. The next witness was Reverend Wallace. He sat in the witness chair with his hands folded, the picture of moral authority. Evelyn's lawyer asked, Reverend, you've known Mrs. Rowe since she arrived in Flat Creek, correct? That's correct. She came to the church seeking help several months ago. And what was your impression of her situation at that time? Wallace's expression was pained, like the memory troubled him. She was desperate. 3 children, no means of support, clearly at the end of her resources. Did the church offer assistance? We wanted to, but our resources are limited. We serve a small congregation. I prayed with her and wished her well. Webb was on his feet instantly. Your Honor, I'd like to enter into evidence a sworn statement from Mrs. Margaret Foster, who was present during Mrs. Rowe's visit to the church. The judge nodded. Proceed. Webb read from the paper in his hand. Mrs. Foster states, I was cleaning the church hall when I heard Reverend Wallace speaking with a woman. She was begging for work, any kind of work. She offered to clean, to cook, to do anything. The Reverend told her we had no positions available and closed the door. I heard her crying on the church steps afterward. It broke my heart. Webb looked up at the Reverend. Does that sound accurate? Wallace's face had gone red. I don't recall the exact conversation, but you do recall turning away a desperate mother with 3 starving children from the house of worship you represent? It wasn't the church's finances, yes or no, Reverend? Did you turn her away? Yes, but thank you. No further questions. Hannah saw Evelyn's lawyer whisper something to the Reverend as he left the stand, clearly displeased that the testimony had backfired. But the damage to Hannah's case had already been done. The image of her begging at the church door was now in the judge's mind. The morning dragged on with more witnesses. The boarding house matron testified about propriety and reputation. The general store owner testified about how little Silas purchased, implying poverty. Each piece of testimony was carefully crafted to build a picture of instability and desperation. When the court broke for lunch, Hannah stepped outside with Silas, her legs shaking. "They're making us sound like criminals," she said, her voice tight. "They're doing their job," Webb said, joining them on the courthouse steps. "And we'll do ours this afternoon. Tom Bradley will testify, and I'm calling you to the stand as well." Hannah's stomach dropped. "Me? You're the mother. The judge needs to hear directly from you." Webb's expression softened slightly. "I know it's hard, but this is where we fight back. Trust me." The afternoon session began with Tom Bradley taking the stand. He was nervous but honest, his rough hands gripping the armrests of the witness chair. "Mr. Bradley," Webb began, "how long have you known Silas Mercer?" "Going on 8 years now. He's a regular customer at my feed store." "And what's your opinion of his character?" "Silas is as solid as they come, pays his bills on time, keeps his word, doesn't cause trouble, works harder than any 3 men I know." "Have you observed him with the Rowe children?" Tom nodded. "Saw him in town with them about a month back. The boy was helping load supplies, proud as could be. Mr. Mercer was teaching him how to secure a load properly, patient-like. Not everyone has that kind of patience with kids." "And Mrs. Mercer?" "She's turned that household around. I delivered flour out there 2 weeks ago, and the place looked like a different world. Garden growing, chickens healthy, cabin clean. Those kids were running around laughing, looking healthy and happy. That's not what suffering looks like." Evelyn's lawyer stood for cross-examination. "Mr. Bradley, you mentioned Mr. Mercer pays his bills on time. Does that mean he has significant financial resources?" Tom hesitated. "He gets by." "Just gets by? So he's not wealthy?" "No, but he's not poor either. He makes an honest living. An honest living on a small ranch with limited prospects. And now he's supporting a wife and 3 additional children. Doesn't that concern you? People have raised families on less. But wouldn't these children have better opportunities with a grandmother who has significant financial means?" Tom's jaw set stubbornly. "Money isn't everything. I've seen rich kids who were miserable and poor kids who were loved. I know which I'd choose." "That wasn't the question." "It's the only answer that matters." The lawyer dismissed him with barely concealed irritation. Hannah wanted to hug Tom Bradley. Then Webb called Hannah to the stand. She walked forward on legs that felt like water, placed her hand on the Bible, and swore to tell the truth. The witness chair was hard and uncomfortable. She could feel everyone's eyes on her, Evelyn's cold judgment, Silas's quiet support, her children's desperate hope. Webb approached gently. "Mrs. Mercer, tell the court about the day you met Silas." Hannah took a breath and began. She told them about the road, the oak tree, the moment when she'd realized she couldn't take another step. She told them about Silas stopping, about his simple question, "When did your kids last eat?" and how that question had cut through all her pride and desperation to the simple truth underneath. "He didn't ask me why I was there or where I was going," Hannah said, her voice steady now. "He just asked when my children had eaten, and when I told him, he fed them. No conditions, no judgment, just fed them." "And when he offered you work?" "I was suspicious. I thought there had to be a catch, but there wasn't. He needed help. I needed work. It was that simple." Webb nodded. "Tell the court about life on the ranch." Hannah described the early mornings, the chores, the slow building of routine and trust. She described Nate learning to mend fences, Lily singing to the chickens, Ben getting fat and happy on fresh milk. "They're thriving," she said, and her voice cracked slightly. "For the first time since their father died, they're actually thriving. They laugh, they play, they're not afraid anymore." "Why were they afraid before?" "Because I was afraid. Because every day was a fight to survive, and they could feel that. They knew we were one disaster away from losing everything." Hannah looked directly at the judge. "Now they're safe. They know where their next meal is coming from. They know they have a home. That's worth more than any amount of money." Webb let that sit for a moment, then asked, "Tell the court about your marriage to Silas Mercer." Hannah had known this question was coming, but it still felt like walking onto thin ice. "We married quickly, yes, but not because we were trying to fool anyone. We married because—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Because somewhere along the way, we became a family. And when Evelyn threatened to take my children, Silas stood with me. He didn't have to. He chose to. Do you love him? The question hung in the air. Hannah could feel Silas's eyes on her, could feel Evelyn's smirk, could feel the judge waiting. I respect him, Hannah said slowly. I trust him. I value him. Is that love? Maybe not the kind in fairy tales, but it's real, and it's growing, and it's built on something stronger than romance. It's built on choice. We choose each other every day. That's what marriage is supposed to be. Webb smiled slightly. No further questions. Evelyn's lawyer approached like a shark scenting blood. Mrs. Mercer, you said you were suspicious when Mr. Mercer offered you work. Why? Because people don't usually help strangers without expecting something in return. Exactly. So what did he expect in return? Work, that's all. Are you sure? A lonely rancher, a desperate widow? Are you certain there were no other expectations? Hannah's face went hot. There were none. And yet you're now married to him, sharing his bed. Isn't that exactly what you were afraid of? Webb shot up. Objection, Your Honor, this is overruled. The witness may answer. Hannah forced herself to meet the lawyer's eyes. I married Silas because I chose to, not because I was forced. There's a difference. Is there? Or did you simply trade one form of desperation for another? I traded fear for safety, hunger for security, isolation for family. I'd make that trade again in a heartbeat. The lawyer's expression hardened. Let's talk about the night of June 15th. 3 men came to the ranch, correct? Hannah's blood ran cold. How did he know about that? Yes, she said carefully, and you fired a rifle at them. I fired a warning shot. A warning shot. Mrs. Mercer, do you have experience with firearms? I learned that night. So you, with no training, picked up a deadly weapon and fired it while your children were in the next room? Hannah's hands clenched in her lap. Those men were trying to break down my door. I protected my children. By escalating violence? What if you'd missed? What if the bullet had gone through the door and hit someone? What if one of those men had been armed and fired back? They weren't trying to have a conversation. They were going to hurt us. Or perhaps they were simply travelers looking for help, and you overreacted out of fear and paranoia. Hannah's voice turned to ice. They were not travelers. They knew Silas was gone. They knew we were alone. And they tried to force their way in. I did what I had to do. What you had to do. That's interesting phrasing, because Mr. Mercer used similar words to justify killing 3 men in New Mexico, didn't he? The courtroom went silent. I don't know what Silas said, Hannah replied. I wasn't there. But you know he killed those men. I know he defended himself and his brother. And you think that makes him a suitable guardian for children? Hannah's control snapped. She leaned forward, her voice sharp and clear. I think Silas Mercer is the only reason my children are alive today. I think he's shown more kindness and decency than anyone else in this town, including the so-called respectable people who watched us starve. I think he's taught my son what it means to be a man, not through violence, but through hard work and integrity and keeping your word. And I think if you're asking whether I trust him with my children's lives, the answer is absolutely yes, without hesitation, every single time. The lawyer stepped back, clearly not expecting that response. No further questions. Hannah left the stand on shaking legs and returned to her seat beside Silas. He didn't touch her. They were in public, being watched, but she felt his presence like an anchor. You did good, he murmured so quietly only she could hear. But Hannah wasn't so sure. She'd let her anger show, had defended Silas with fierce emotion instead of calm facts. Webb had told her to stay controlled, and she'd failed. The next witness was Evelyn herself. She took the stand with the bearing of a queen, her expensive dress rustling, her silver hair perfect. She placed her hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth with a voice that dripped condescension. Evelyn's lawyer began with gentle questions. Mrs. Rowe, tell the court about your son Robert. Evelyn's expression softened convincingly. Robert was a good man, hard-working, devoted to his family. His death was a tragedy. And when you learned of his passing, what did you do? I reached out to Hannah immediately, offering to help with the children. I have a large home in Austin, staff, Resources. I thought it would be best for everyone if the children came to live with me while Hannah sorted out her affairs. And did she accept your offer? No, she refused to even respond to my letter. Did that concern you? Deeply. I worried about the children's welfare. Webb stood. Objection. Mrs. Rowe is characterizing her emotional state, not providing facts. Sustained. Mrs. Rowe, please stick to what you did, not what you felt. Evelyn nodded graciously. I waited several months, hoping Hannah would reconsider. When I heard rumors that she was living in questionable circumstances, I knew I had to act. What did you hear specifically? That she was living with a man she wasn't married to, that the children were working in the fields, that they were miles from any school or church. And this prompted you to file for custody? Yes, I love those children. They're all I have left of my son. I want to give them the life Robert would have wanted for them. Education, opportunity, stability. It was a masterful performance. Even Hannah had to admit it sounded reasonable if you didn't know the truth underneath. Webb approached for cross-examination, and his demeanor had changed. Gone was the gentle approach he'd used with Hannah. Now he was surgical. Mrs. Rowe, you said you reached out to Hannah immediately after your son's death. Define immediately. Within days of the funeral. And your letter offered to help with the children. What specific help did you offer? Evelyn hesitated, just for a fraction of a second. I offered to take them into my home. To help Hannah with them, or to take them from her? To provide for them while Hannah grieved. For how long? As long as necessary. And did you offer Hannah any financial support to help her care for the children herself? She didn't ask. Did you offer yes or no? No. Webb pulled a paper from his file. I have here a copy of the letter you sent to Hannah. Would you like me to read it to the court? Evelyn's jaw tightened. That won't be necessary. I think it is. Your letter states, and I quote, "Given your limited resources and the burden of 3 small children, I am prepared to offer them a home in Austin where they can be properly raised. This would allow you to start fresh without the complications of motherhood weighing you down." Complications of motherhood. Is that how you view Hannah's children? As complications? That's not. I was trying to be helpful. You were trying to take them. And when Hannah refused, you waited months, not to help, not to support, but to build a case against her. That's not true. Isn't it? You hired a lawyer, traveled to Flat Creek, interviewed witnesses, all while never once offering Hannah a single dollar to help feed those children you claim to love so much. Evelyn's composure was cracking. She was living in sin. She was surviving, and you judged her for it instead of helping her. Webb's voice was hard now. Tell the court, Mrs. Rowe, when was the last time you actually saw your grandchildren? At the funeral. So you haven't seen them in over 6 months. You don't know what they look like now, what they enjoy, what makes them laugh. You don't know that Nathan wants to be a rancher like Silas, or that Lillian has named every chicken on the property, or that Benjamin took his first steps last week. You don't know any of that because you haven't been there. I wasn't permitted. You weren't prevented. You were wealthy enough to travel, powerful enough to hire lawyers, but you never once showed up at that ranch to simply visit your grandchildren. Why? Evelyn's mask finally shattered. Because I wouldn't set foot in that place. Living with a stranger in poverty, doing manual labor like common servants, it's beneath them. Robert deserved better, and so do his children. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Judge Sullivan banged his gavel. Webb pressed his advantage. So this isn't about the children's welfare at all. This is about your pride, about what you think they deserve based on your standards, not their needs. They deserve a proper home. They have one. What you mean is they deserve a home that meets your approval. There's a difference. Evelyn was shaking now, her careful composure gone. You don't understand. I understand perfectly. You want to control them because they're all you have left of your son. But they're not possessions, Mrs. Rowe. They're children with a mother who loves them in a home where they're happy. And no amount of money changes that. Webb returned to his seat. Evelyn sat in the witness chair, her face blotchy with rage and shame. No longer the dignified grandmother, but something smaller and meaner. Her lawyer tried to rehabilitate her testimony with redirect questions, but the damage was done. When Evelyn finally left the stand, she wouldn't meet anyone's eyes. Judge Sullivan called a 15-minute recess. Hannah stepped outside, her whole body trembling with adrenaline. Webb followed her. "That was incredible," Hannah said. "The way you broke her down." "It was necessary, but it's not over. The judge could still rule in her favor based on financial circumstances alone." Webb lit a cigarette, his hand surprisingly steady. "We need to hope he values the truth over appearances." When court resumed, Webb called his final witness. "I call Silas Mercer to the stand." Silas stood and walked forward with the same calm confidence he brought to everything. He placed his hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth, then sat in the witness chair looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. Webb started gently. "Mr. Mercer, tell the court why you stopped for Hannah on that road." Silas was quiet for a moment, gathering his thoughts. "Because she looked like I felt 12 years ago, lost, desperate, out of options." He paused. "And because her kids looked hungry." "Why did you offer her work?" "Because I needed help, and she needed work. Seemed simple." "Did you have any ulterior motives?" "No." "Did you expect anything from her beyond the work?" "No." "When did you decide to marry her?" Silas's jaw worked. "When I realized I couldn't stand the thought of her leaving. When I knew I'd fight to protect her and those kids with everything I had. That's when I knew." "Tell the court about the night the riders came." Silas described it plainly. The timeline, the threats, Hannah's response. "She was braver than most men I've known. Stood her ground, protected her children, didn't back down. I was proud of her." Webb nodded. "Mr. Mercer, let's talk about New Mexico." The courtroom went still. Hannah held her breath. 12 years ago, you were involved in a shooting that killed 3 men. Tell the court what happened." Silas's expression went distant, like he was seeing something far away. "My brother and I were moving cattle through the Pecos territory. 5 men ambushed us at night. They shot Marcus before we knew they were there. He died in my arms while I fought off the others. When it was over, 3 of them were dead, 1 ran, and 1 was wounded. I turned myself into the law that same night." "Why did they attack you?" "Territory dispute. They worked for a rancher who claimed we were trespassing. We weren't, but he wanted us gone, so he sent men to make sure we never came back." "And the trial?" "Lasted 3 days. Evidence showed self-defense. The wounded man admitted they'd been paid to kill us. Judge ruled in my favor, but barely. The rancher had connections. I left New Mexico the next day because I knew those connections would keep coming for me." "Do you regret what you did?" Silas looked directly at the judge. "I regret that my brother died. I regret that I couldn't save him. But I don't regret defending our lives. And I don't regret surviving when good men wanted me dead for crossing their land." "Have you been in any violent altercations since?" "None." "Have you ever raised a hand to Hannah or the children?" "Never." "Would you?" "I'd cut off my own hands first." The certainty in his voice echoed through the courtroom. Evelyn's lawyer approached for cross-examination, but he looked less confident now. "Mr. Mercer, you claim the shooting was self-defense, but you killed 3 men. Doesn't that strike you as excessive?" "They were trying to kill me. I did what I had to do to survive." "And you expect this court to believe you're a suitable guardian for children when you've proven capable of such violence?" Silas's eyes went hard. "I expect this court to understand the difference between murder and survival. I protected my brother until my last breath. I'd do the same for those kids. That's not violence. That's love." The lawyer tried a few more questions, but Silas was unshakable. He left the stand with his head high. Judge Sullivan addressed the courtroom. "I'll take this matter under advisement and issue my ruling tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. Court is adjourned." The gavel fell. Hannah stood on shaking legs, her whole world hanging in the balance of one man's decision. Silas took her arm and guided her outside where the evening air was cool and clean. "What do we do now?" Hannah asked. "We wait," Silas said, "and we hope." That night, neither of them slept. They sat together in the cabin's main room, watching the fire burn down to embers, not talking, just existing in the heavy silence of uncertainty. Finally, as dawn approached, Silas spoke. Whatever happens tomorrow, I want you to know something." Hannah looked at him, this man who'd become her husband, her partner, her unexpected salvation. "You're the best thing that ever happened to me," Silas said quietly. "You and those kids. Even if we lose tomorrow, even if they take them away, I won't regret a single day. You made me remember what it's like to have something worth fighting for." Hannah felt tears slide down her cheeks. "I love you," she said, and realized as she said it that it was true. Not the passionate romance of fairy tales, but something deeper and more real, the love that came from surviving together, from choosing each other day after day, from building something solid out of nothing. Silas pulled her close, and they held each other as the sun rose on the day that would determine their future. The courtroom was packed when they arrived. Everyone in town seemed to have come to witness the verdict. Hannah sat with Silas, holding his hand so tightly her fingers went numb. Judge Sullivan entered, his expression unreadable. He sat, shuffled papers, and finally looked up at the crowd. "I've considered all the testimony and evidence presented in this case," he began. "This is not a simple matter of wealth versus poverty or respectability versus scandal. This is a question of what serves the best interests of 3 children who have already endured significant loss and upheaval." Hannah couldn't breathe. Mrs. Evelyn Rowe presented a compelling case for financial security and social advantage. However, her testimony revealed a concerning focus on appearances and control rather than the children's emotional needs. Furthermore, her failure to provide any support during Mrs. Mercer's time of greatest need speaks to priorities that trouble this court. Evelyn's lawyer stood. "Your Honor." "Sit down, counselor. I'm not finished." The lawyer sat. "Mr. and Mrs." Mercer presented a less polished case, but one built on a foundation of genuine care and sacrifice. The children are healthy, happy, and thriving in their care. The marriage, while recent, appears to be entered into with honest intent and mutual commitment. And while Mr. Mercer's past contains violence, the circumstances were clearly self-defense, and his behavior in the subsequent 12 years has been exemplary. Hannah's heart was pounding so hard she thought it might burst. Therefore, it is the ruling of this court that custody of Nathan, Lillian, and Benjamin Rowe shall remain with their mother, Hannah Mercer, and her husband, Silas Mercer. Mrs. Evelyn Rowe's petition is denied. The courtroom exploded. Hannah heard nothing but a roaring in her ears. Silas's arms came around her, and she collapsed against him, sobbing with relief. They'd won. They'd actually won. Judge Sullivan banged his gavel for order. "Furthermore, I'm issuing a protective order. Mrs. Evelyn Rowe is prohibited from contacting the children or the Mercer family for a period of no less than 1 year, unless supervised visitation is agreed upon by both parties. Any violation will result in contempt charges." Evelyn shot to her feet, her face purple with rage. "This is an outrage. You can't." "I can, and I have. One more outburst, and I'll hold you in contempt right now. Sit down." Evelyn sat, shaking with fury. The judge continued. "This court recognizes that unconventional families can provide loving homes. Blood and money do not automatically equate to better care. These children have a mother who fought for them and a stepfather who stands with them. That is what matters. Case closed." The gavel fell for the final time. Hannah turned in Silas's arms and kissed him, right there in the courtroom in front of everyone. She didn't care anymore about propriety or what people thought. Her children were safe, her family was intact, they'd survived. The ride home from the courthouse should have felt like a victory parade, but Hannah couldn't shake the cold dread settling in her stomach. Evelyn's face in that courtroom, twisted with rage and humiliation, had looked like a woman who wouldn't accept defeat quietly. The protective order was just paper. Paper didn't stop people who were desperate or vengeful enough. Silas must have sensed her unease because his hand found hers in the wagon seat, squeezing gently. "It's over," he said, but even he didn't sound completely convinced. The children were waiting at the neighbor's house, and when Hannah told them the news, Nate's face crumpled with relief. He'd been carrying the weight of fear for so long that watching it finally lift nearly broke Hannah's heart. Lily threw her arms around Hannah's waist and wouldn't let go. Even Ben seemed to sense the shift in atmosphere, gurgling happily as they loaded back into the wagon. They celebrated that night with a simple dinner, but it felt like a feast. Hannah made biscuits with honey and fried chicken that Silas had been saving for a special occasion. The children ate until they were stuffed, and afterward Nate asked if he could stay up late, just this once. Just this once, Silas agreed, and they sat on the porch, watching stars emerge in the vast Texas sky while Lily fell asleep against Hannah's shoulder and Ben dozed in her arms. "What happens now?" Nate asked quietly. He was looking at Silas, man to man, the way he'd started doing more often lately. "Now we live," Silas said. "We work the ranch, we take care of each other, and we don't let fear run our lives anymore." "What if she comes back? That lady. My grandmother." Hannah's chest tightened, but Silas answered before she could. "Then we deal with it. But the law's on our side now, Nate. She can't just take you. She'd have to fight through me and your mother first, and I promise you, that's not a fight she'd win." Nate nodded slowly, processing this. Then he said something that caught them both off guard. "I'm glad Mama married you. You're good for us." Silas cleared his throat, clearly moved. "You're good for me too, son." It was the first time he'd called Nate that, and the word hung in the night air like a benediction. Hannah saw her boy's shoulders straighten with pride, saw him sit a little taller, and she knew that whatever else happened, this moment right here was worth every hardship they'd endured. 3 days later, the first sign of trouble arrived. Hannah was in the garden when she saw the rider approaching, not the slow, casual pace of a neighbor, but the purposeful speed of someone on a mission. Her stomach clenched as the man drew closer, and she recognized him as a clerk from the courthouse in Flat Creek. Silas emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on his pants. And some, "Help you?" The clerk dismounted, looking uncomfortable. "Got a notice here for you and Mrs. Mercer, from Mrs. Evelyn Rowe's attorney." Hannah's blood ran cold. Silas took the envelope and opened it while the clerk shifted his weight awkwardly. As Silas read, his expression darkened dangerously. "What is it?" Hannah asked, already knowing it was bad. Silas handed her the paper. It was a legal challenge to the land deed of the ranch itself. Evelyn's lawyer was claiming there were irregularities in Silas's original purchase, suggesting the deed might be invalid, which would make the ranch, and by extension their home, subject to seizure for unpaid debts that the lawyer claimed existed. It was absurd. It was transparent. It was also potentially devastating. "This is revenge," Hannah said, her voice shaking. "She's trying to destroy us because she lost." The clerk looked even more uncomfortable. "I'm just delivering the notice, ma'am. There'll be a hearing in 2 weeks." He climbed back on his horse and rode away quickly, like he couldn't get away from them fast enough. Silas read through the document again, his jaw set in a hard line. "This is garbage. My deed is solid. I bought this land fair and square 8 years ago, paid every cent, got it recorded properly." "But fighting it will cost money we don't have," Hannah said. "That's what she's counting on. Even if we win, we'll be bankrupted by legal fees." They stood there in the yard, the notice fluttering in Hannah's hand, and for the first time since the custody hearing, Hannah felt genuine despair creeping back in. They'd won the battle only to face a new war. That night, after the children were asleep, Hannah and Silas sat at the kitchen table going through every paper Silas had related to the ranch purchase. The deed looked legitimate to Hannah's eyes, but she wasn't a lawyer. The sale documents were yellowed with age, but clearly showed payment in full. Everything seemed in order. "I don't understand what she thinks she'll find," Hannah said, rubbing her tired eyes. "Unless she's planning to fabricate evidence." "Wouldn't put it past her," Silas muttered. He was on his third cup of coffee, his hair standing up where he'd run his hands through it repeatedly. "But fabricated evidence can be exposed. We just need to prove the deed is legitimate beyond any doubt." "How do we do that?" "The county recorder's office should have the original documentation. We get certified copies, bring in the clerk who filed it if he's still alive, maybe track down the previous owner if we can find him." Silas leaned back in his chair, exhaustion evident in every line of his body. "It'll take time and money, but it's possible." Hannah reached across the table and took his hand. "We'll figure it out. We've come too far to lose now." But even as she said it, she wondered how much more they could endure. How many battles could they fight before something finally broke them? The answer came from an unexpected source 3 days later. Hannah was hanging laundry when she saw another rider approaching, and her heart sank. But as the rider got closer, she realized it wasn't a courthouse clerk or one of Evelyn's lawyers. It was a woman, elegantly dressed, riding side saddle with practiced ease. The woman dismounted near the porch and removed her riding gloves. She was perhaps 50, with kind eyes and silver threading through her dark hair. Something about her bearing seemed familiar, though Hannah couldn't place it. "Mrs. Mercer?" the woman asked. "Yes," Hannah said warily. "My name is Catherine Hale. I'm Evelyn Rowe's sister." Hannah's stomach dropped. She took an instinctive step backward, ready to call for Silas, but Catherine raised her hands in a peaceable gesture. "Please, I'm not here to cause trouble. Quite the opposite, actually. May I speak with you and your husband?" Silas had already appeared from the barn, alerted by the unfamiliar visitor. He positioned himself between Catherine and Hannah, his body language protective. Catherine seemed to understand the dynamic. "Mr. Mercer, I know you have no reason to trust me, but I have information about my sister's latest legal maneuver that you need to hear." "What kind of information?" Silas asked, his voice hard. "The kind that might save your home. May we speak inside?" Hannah and Silas exchanged glances. Finally, Hannah nodded. They couldn't afford to dismiss potential help, no matter the source. Inside, Catherine accepted a cup of tea but didn't drink it, her hands wrapped around the cup like she needed something to hold on to. When she spoke, her voice was heavy with old grief and fresh regret. "I need you to understand something first. Evelyn wasn't always like this. When we were young, she was kind, generous, full of dreams. But life hardened her. She married a man who valued money over love, gave her one son, and then ignored her for 30 years until he died. Robert was everything to her, the only good thing in her life that she felt she'd created." "I understand grief," Hannah said quietly, "but that doesn't excuse what she's doing." "No, it doesn't," Catherine agreed. "That's why I'm here. When Robert died, something in Evelyn broke. She became obsessed with controlling what little remained of him, his children. When you refused to hand them over, she took it as a personal betrayal." "They're my children," Hannah said, steel in her voice. "I know, and you're a good mother. I could see that in the courtroom." Catherine set down her teacup. "After the custody hearing, Evelyn went to my home in Austin. She was unhinged, ranting about how the judge was bought off, how you'd seduced everyone with lies, how she'd make you pay for humiliating her." Silas leaned forward. "What did she do?" "She's bribing the county recorder, a man named Willis Henderson. She's paying him to discover irregularities in your land deed and to testify that the documentation was improperly filed." Catherine pulled an envelope from her bag. "I have proof. Letters between Evelyn and Henderson discussing payment, a draft of the false testimony he's supposed to give, even a record of the money she transferred to his account." Hannah's hands trembled as she took the envelope. Inside were copies of letters in Evelyn's distinctive handwriting, laying out the entire scheme in damning detail. "Why are you giving us this?" Silas asked, suspicion still evident. Catherine's eyes filled with tears. "Because this has gone too far. Because those children deserve peace. And you two have given them that. Because I'm ashamed of what my sister has become, and I can't stand by and watch her destroy innocent people to satisfy her need for control." She wiped her eyes roughly. "And because I loved Robert too, and he would be horrified by what his mother is doing in his name." Hannah felt something crack open in her chest. "Thank you," she whispered. "You don't know what this means." "I do, actually. I lost my own children years ago to scarlet fever. If I could have them back, I'd move heaven and earth. But I wouldn't destroy other families to ease my grief. That's where Evelyn and I differ." Catherine stood. "Take those documents to your lawyer. They should be enough to stop this legal challenge and possibly have Evelyn investigated for fraud and bribery." Silas stood as well. "Mrs. Hale, we're in your debt." "No debt, just take care of those children. Give them the life Robert wanted for them, one filled with love, not money or status. That's payment enough." Catherine left as quietly as she'd arrived, and Hannah stood on the porch watching her ride away, this unlikely ally who'd appeared exactly when they needed her most. That evening, they rode into Flat Creek and delivered the documents to Marcus Webb. The lawyer's eyes widened as he read through them, his expression shifting from skepticism to amazement to grim satisfaction. "This is extraordinary," Webb said. "This is everything we need. Not only will it stop the land challenge, but it could result in criminal charges against both Evelyn Rowe and Willis Henderson." "What happens now?" Hannah asked. "Now I file an emergency motion to dismiss the land challenge and submit these documents as evidence of fraud. Then I contact the district attorney's office about the bribery." Webb looked up at them, something like respect in his eyes. "Mrs. Mercer, Mr. Mercer, I think this nightmare is finally about to end." The hearing was scheduled for the following week. Hannah spent the days in between in a state of anxious anticipation, unable to quite believe that this might actually be over. She cooked and cleaned and cared for the children, but her mind was always half elsewhere, waiting for the other shoe to drop. The night before the hearing, Silas found her sitting on the porch steps, staring out at the dark land beyond the cabin. "Can't sleep?" he asked, settling beside her. "Can't stop thinking," Hannah admitted. "What if it's not enough? What if she finds another way to hurt us? Then we'll survive that too." Silas's voice was calm, certain. "We've survived everything else." Hannah leaned against his shoulder, drawing strength from his solid presence. "When did you become such an optimist?" "When I married a woman stubborn enough to fight the whole world for her kids. It's contagious." Hannah laughed despite herself, and the sound felt good, felt normal. "I love you," she said again, and it was easier to say now, more natural. "I love you too," Silas replied, and wrapped his arm around her. They sat like that until the stars came out. Two people who'd found each other in the darkness and built something worth keeping. The hearing the next morning was brief and brutal for Evelyn Rowe. Judge Sullivan reviewed the documents Catherine had provided, his expression growing darker with each page. He called Willis Henderson to the stand, and when confronted with the evidence, the man crumbled immediately, admitting everything in exchange for leniency. Evelyn's lawyer tried to distance his client from Henderson's actions, claiming she'd been misled or manipulated, but the letters in Evelyn's own handwriting told a different story. When the judge asked Evelyn directly if she'd participated in the bribery scheme, her lawyer advised her to invoke her right against self-incrimination. Judge Sullivan's face was like thunder. "Mrs. Rowe, you have attempted to pervert the course of justice in my courtroom through fraud and bribery. The land challenge against Mr. Mercer is dismissed with prejudice. Furthermore, I am referring this matter to the district attorney for criminal prosecution. And I am extending the protective order preventing you from contacting the Mercer family indefinitely." "Your Honor," Evelyn's lawyer began. "I'm not finished. Mrs. Rowe, you came to this town claiming to want what's best for your grandchildren, but every action you've taken has been about control and revenge, not love. You've shown yourself to be vindictive, manipulative, and willing to break the law to get what you want. If I never see you in my courtroom again, it will be too soon. We're adjourned." The gavel fell like a guillotine. Evelyn stood slowly, her face ashen. For just a moment, her eyes met Hannah's across the courtroom, and Hannah saw something there that looked almost like regret. But then Evelyn's expression hardened, and she walked out with her head high, disappearing into whatever consequences awaited her. Hannah felt Silas's hand on the small of her back and turned into his embrace, letting herself finally believe it was over. The weeks that followed felt like waking up from a long nightmare. The district attorney filed charges against both Evelyn and Henderson. The case against Henderson was straightforward, and he pleaded guilty within a month. Evelyn's case was more complicated. She had money for good lawyers and connections that could have dragged things out for years. But Catherine Hale had one more gift to give them. She showed up at the ranch on a warm October afternoon with a leather portfolio under her arm. Hannah invited her in, and this time the visit felt less fraught, more like welcoming an old friend. "I've been in contact with Evelyn's lawyers," Catherine said without preamble. "I've made them an offer on behalf of the family estate. If Evelyn agrees to plead guilty to reduced charges, accepts probation and a fine, and permanently relinquishes any claim to contact with the children, we'll pay her legal fees and maintain her position in Austin society. If she refuses and forces a trial, I'll testify against her and the family will disown her completely." Hannah stared at her. "You do that? Testify against your own sister?" "I've already done it," Catherine said quietly. I gave a deposition last week detailing everything I know about her schemes and her state of mind. She's been obsessed with those children to the point of mental instability. The lawyers believe that with my testimony and the documentary evidence, they could get her committed to an asylum for psychiatric evaluation. Silas let out a low whistle. That's a hell of a threat. It's not a threat. It's a promise. Evelyn needs help, but I can't force her to get it unless she's deemed a danger to herself or others. This legal pressure might be the only thing that saves her from herself. Catherine's expression was pained. I love my sister, but I can't let her destroy more lives. Yours or her own. 2 weeks later, Evelyn accepted the deal. She pleaded guilty to attempted bribery of a public official, received 2 years probation and a substantial fine, and signed legal documents permanently waiving any claim to visitation or custody of her grandchildren. In exchange, she avoided jail time and maintained enough of her reputation to continue living in Austin without complete social ruin. Catherine delivered the signed documents personally, along with a sealed letter addressed to Hannah. She wrote this after signing the agreement, Catherine said. You don't have to read it if you don't want to. Hannah took the letter but didn't open it immediately. Some things required the right moment, the right headspace. She thanked Catherine again, and this time when they said goodbye, they embraced like family. That evening, after the children were in bed, Hannah sat on the porch with Silas and finally opened Evelyn's letter. The handwriting was shaky, unlike the confident script Hannah remembered. The letter was short. Hannah, I will not apologize for loving my grandchildren or wanting what I believed was best for them, but I recognize now that my grief turned into something ugly and destructive. Catherine tells me the children are happy, healthy, thriving. I suppose that should be enough. I hope someday they'll understand I acted out of love, however misguided. I hope they'll remember their father fondly. And I hope, though I have no right to ask, that you might tell them occasionally about the grandmother who loved them, even if she didn't know how to show it properly. I release you from any obligation to me, and I will honor the agreement to stay away. Perhaps that is the last gift I can give them. Peace. Evelyn. Hannah read it twice, then handed it to Silas. When he finished, he looked at her questioningly. Do you think she means it? Hannah asked. I think grief makes people do terrible things, Silas said. And I think maybe she finally realized what she was becoming. He folded the letter carefully. What will you tell the kids? Hannah thought about that. Someday, when they're older, I'll tell them the truth. That their grandmother loved them, but let her grief poison that love into something harmful. That we protected them because that's what family does. And that she finally chose to let them go so they could be happy. She paused. But I won't let her cruelty define how they remember Robert. He was a good man, and they deserve to know that. Silas pulled her close. You're a better person than I am. No, Hannah said. I'm just a mother who understands how fear and desperation can make you do desperate things. I'm not excusing what she did, but I understand the pain underneath it. They sat in comfortable silence as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold that reminded Hannah of that first sunset when Silas had brought them to the ranch. So much had changed since then. So much had been fought for and won. The seasons turned, bringing winter's cold and spring's renewal. The ranch thrived under Hannah's management and Silas's hard work. The garden produced more than they needed, and Hannah started selling vegetables in town, bringing in extra money that let them buy proper winter coats for the children and replace the cabin's leaking roof. Nate grew tall and strong, spending every spare moment with Silas, learning everything about ranching. By his 12th birthday, he could rope a calf, shoe a horse, and fix a fence better than most grown men. But he could also read by the fire at night, his mother having taught him, from the book she'd ordered from a catalog, determined he'd have the education she'd never received. Lily blossomed into a bright, chattering presence who made friends with every person and animal she encountered. She started a small egg business, selling to the neighbors, carefully saving her earnings in a jar she kept hidden under her bed. She wanted to buy her mother a new dress, she told Silas in confidence, because Mama deserved pretty things. Ben grew from a baby into a rambunctious toddler who followed his older siblings everywhere, his laughter filling the cabin with joy. He called Silas Papa without any prompting or confusion, Because as far as Ben was concerned, Silas had always been his father. And Hannah and Silas's marriage, which had begun as a practical arrangement, deepened into something neither of them had expected. They learned each other's rhythms, each other's silences. They discovered how to work together seamlessly, how to parent as a unified team, how to love each other with a quiet constancy that didn't need grand gestures or flowery words. On their first anniversary, Silas surprised Hannah with a gift, a simple gold band to replace the plain one from their hasty wedding. "It's not fancy," he said, almost apologetically, as he slipped it on her finger. "But it's real gold, and it's yours." Hannah looked at the ring, tears blurring her vision. "It's perfect," she whispered, and kissed him with a passion that made him laugh in surprise. "What was that for?" "For being you, for choosing us, for making me believe in second chances." That night they made love for the first time, not out of obligation or awkwardness, but out of genuine desire and deep affection. Afterward, lying in the darkness with Silas's arms around her, Hannah felt a completeness she'd never experienced before. This was what home felt like. This was what love felt like when it was earned through shared struggles and built on solid ground. The following spring brought unexpected news. Hannah woke one morning feeling queasy, and the symptoms persisted for weeks. When she finally accepted what her body was telling her, she sat Silas down with shaking hands. "I'm pregnant," she said simply. Silas stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then a slow smile spread across his face, a real, genuine smile that transformed him completely. "A baby," he said wonderingly. "Our baby." "Are you happy?" Hannah asked, suddenly uncertain. "Happy." Silas pulled her into his arms. "Hannah, I'm terrified and thrilled and more grateful than I know how to say. A baby. Our baby." He kept repeating it like he couldn't quite believe it, and Hannah laughed through her tears, joy bubbling up from somewhere deep inside. They told the children that evening. Nate's eyes went wide. "A baby? Really?" "Really," Hannah confirmed. Lily squealed with delight. "Can it be a girl? I want a sister." "We don't get to choose," Silas said, but he was grinning. Even Ben seemed to understand something exciting was happening, clapping his hands and babbling happily. The pregnancy was easier than Hannah's previous ones, probably because she wasn't starving or desperately afraid. She had good food, a warm home, and a husband who fussed over her despite her protest that she was perfectly capable of doing her chores. "You're carrying our child," Silas said when she complained about his hovering. "Let me take care of you." And Hannah, who'd fought so hard to be self-sufficient, learned to let herself be cared for. It was harder than it should have been, but Silas was patient, and gradually she accepted that asking for help wasn't weakness. The baby arrived on a cold December night, a month before Christmas. The labor was hard but manageable, with a midwife from town assisting and Silas pacing outside like a caged animal. When the baby's first cry pierced the night, Hannah heard Silas's whoop of joy from the porch, and she started laughing despite her exhaustion. The midwife placed a tiny, perfect daughter in Hannah's arms. She had dark hair like Silas and Hannah's eyes, and when Silas finally came into the room, he looked at his daughter with such wonder that Hannah fell in love with him all over again. "She's beautiful," he whispered, touching the baby's tiny hand with his scarred, calloused finger. "She's perfect." "What should we name her?" Hannah asked. They discussed names for months, but never settled on one. Now, looking at their daughter, Silas said, "Clara, after my mother, if that's all right with you." "Clara Mercer," Hannah said, testing the name. "It's perfect." The children met their new sister the next morning. Nate was cautious but curious, peering at Clara like she might break. Lily was enchanted, begging to hold her until Hannah relented, carefully positioning the baby in her arms. And Ben, now 2.5, looked at Clara with big eyes and declared, "Baby!" "That's your sister," Hannah told him. "You're a big brother now." Ben processed this seriously, then nodded like he'd accepted a great responsibility. The months after Clara's birth passed in a blur of sleepless nights and simple joys. The cabin that had once housed a desperate widow and her children now rang with the sounds of a real family, arguments and laughter, baby cries and children's games, The quiet murmur of Hannah and Silas talking late into the night while Clara nursed. Hannah had been so focused on survival for so long that it took time to adjust to simply living. But gradually, she learned to enjoy the small moments. Silas teaching Nate to read the stars for navigation, Lily singing lullabies to Clara, Ben trying to help with chores and creating twice as much work. The whole family gathered around the table for dinner. One evening in early spring, almost 2 years after the final court hearing, Hannah stood in the doorway watching her family. Silas was showing Nate something in the Farmer's Almanac. Lily was reading a storybook aloud to Ben, who was actually sitting still for once. Clara was asleep in her cradle, one tiny fist curled near her face. This was everything Hannah had fought for, everything she'd nearly given up on that day under the oak tree, everything she'd feared she'd never have again after Robert died. Silas looked up and caught her watching. "What are you thinking about?" Hannah crossed the room and kissed his forehead. "Just remembering." "Remembering what?" "The day you stopped on that road. The question you asked me." Silas smiled softly. "When's the last time your kids ate?" "That question saved our lives." "No," Silas said, pulling her down into his lap, while Nate made a face and Lily giggled. "You saved your own lives. You walked into that desert with your babies and refused to quit. All I did was give you a place to land." "You gave us everything," Hannah insisted. "We gave each other everything," Silas corrected. "That's how this works." Hannah kissed him properly then, not caring that the children were watching and making exaggerated gagging sounds. When they finally broke apart, Nate was grinning despite himself. "You two are disgusting," he said, but there was affection in his voice. "You'll understand when you're older," Silas told him. "Never," Nate declared dramatically. Lily abandoned her book and climbed into Hannah's lap, squishing herself between her parents. "Tell us a story, Mama." "What kind of story?" "A happy one. About a family that lives on a ranch and has chickens and a baby sister." Hannah looked at Silas, and he was smiling that rare, genuine smile that still made her heart skip. "All right," Hannah said, settling Lily more comfortably. "Once upon a time, there was a mother who thought she'd lost everything. She was tired and scared and didn't know where to go. But then she met a rancher who asked her a simple question, and that question changed everything." As Hannah told the story, their story, transformed into something magical for her daughter, she realized that this was what healing looked like. Not forgetting the hard times, but transforming them into something that could be shared, learned from, even celebrated. The years continued to unfold with their mixture of challenges and triumphs. There were drought years when money got tight, and they had to be creative about making ends meet. There were illnesses that scared them, like when Ben came down with pneumonia and Hannah stayed up 3 nights straight nursing him through it. There were arguments and frustrations because no family was perfect, and living together meant navigating everyone's rough edges. But there was also boundless joy. Nate's first solo cattle drive when he was 16, coming back dusty and proud, and looking so much like a man that Hannah had to excuse herself to cry. Lily's first dance at the town social, wearing a dress Hannah had sewn from fabric Silas bought as a surprise. Ben learning to ride, falling off a dozen times but getting back on with stubborn determination. Clara's first words, first steps, first everything. The ranch grew more prosperous as Silas and Nate worked together to expand the herd and improve the land. Hannah's garden became legendary in the area, and she started teaching other women her techniques. The cabin got additions: a proper bedroom for the older children, a porch that wrapped all the way around, a root cellar that could store enough food to see them through any winter. They became pillars of the community, the family that had overcome scandal and poverty to build something real. People stopped whispering about Hannah's past or Silas's violent history. Now, when the Mercers came to town, they were greeted with respect and genuine warmth. Catherine Hale remained a distant but faithful friend, writing letters several times a year and sending modest gifts at Christmas. Through her, they learned that Evelyn had died quietly in her sleep 4 years after the final hearing, taking whatever regret she had to her grave. Catherine asked if Hannah wanted to tell the children, and after much thought, Hannah did. She sat them down. Nate was 15 by then, Lily 13, Ben 9, and Clara 6, and told them about their other grandmother, about how she'd loved their father deeply, how his death had broken something in her, how grief had turned her love into something destructive. "Why did she want to take us away?" Lily asked, her voice small. "Because she thought she could give you a better life," Hannah said honestly. "Money, education, opportunities we couldn't provide. She wasn't completely wrong about what she could offer. She was wrong about what we needed." "What did we need?" Clara asked, leaning against Hannah's shoulder. "We needed each other. We needed love and safety and a place to belong. Those things don't come from money." "I'm glad we stayed here," Nate said firmly. "I'm glad she didn't take us." The other children nodded agreement, and Hannah felt a weight she hadn't known she was still carrying finally lift. Her children understood. They knew their own story, and they were at peace with it. The day Nate turned 18 and officially became a man, Silas took him aside and did something Hannah hadn't expected. He presented Nate with legal papers, adoption papers he'd had drawn up years ago but never filed, waiting for the right moment. "I know your father was Robert Rowe," Silas said, his voice gruff with emotion. "I'm not trying to replace him or erase him, but if you're willing, I'd like to make official what's been true in my heart since the day I met you. I'd like to adopt you as my son." Nate, who'd grown into a tall, strong young man who looked like Robert but had Silas's steady way of moving through the world, didn't hesitate. "Yes," he said. "Yes, I want that." They went to the courthouse together, the same courthouse where they'd fought for custody years before, and filed the papers. Nathan Rowe became Nathan Mercer, and when they emerged, Nate was grinning like he'd won a prize. Over the following year, Lily and Ben chose to be adopted as well. Only Clara, who'd been born a Mercer, didn't need papers to make it official. But all 4 children knew the truth. Family wasn't about blood or paperwork. It was about showing up every day and choosing each other over and over again. Hannah turned 40 on a bright summer morning, surrounded by her family on the porch of the ranch that had become her fortress and her sanctuary. Nate was courting a sweet girl from town and would probably be married within the year. Lily had discovered a talent for painting and covered the cabin walls with her artwork. Ben was talking about becoming a veterinarian, fascinated by animals and healing, and Clara was already showing signs of being as stubborn and strong-willed as her mother. Silas sat beside Hannah, his hair now more gray than dark. The scar on his face just another familiar feature she'd long stopped noticing. He'd aged well, grown more comfortable in his skin, smiled more readily than he had in those early days. "You know what I was thinking about?" Hannah asked him as they watched their children play in the yard, even the older ones getting pulled into a game of tag with Clara. "What's that?" "That first day, when you stopped on that road. Do you remember what you were thinking?" Silas was quiet for a moment, remembering. "I was thinking that I should mind my own business, that you were a stranger's problem, not mine, that I had enough on my plate without taking on a desperate widow and 3 kids. "What changed your mind?" "Your eyes. You looked at me like you were ready to fight me if I tried anything, but also like you were hoping I might be decent, and your boy had picked up a rock to protect you." Silas shook his head, smiling at the memory. "I thought, these are fighters. They're beat down, but not beaten. And I guess I wanted to see what would happen if someone gave them a chance." "Best decision you ever made?" Hannah asked, teasing. "Best decision I ever made," Silas confirmed, completely serious. He turned to look at her, really look at her. "You know what I see when I look at you now?" "What?" "Home. Not the ranch, not the cabin. You. You're my home, Hannah. You and those kids. Everything good in my life started the day I asked you when your kids last ate." Hannah felt tears prick her eyes, but they were happy tears. "You saved us." "We saved each other," Silas said again, the way he always did when she tried to give him too much credit. And sitting there on the porch, watching her children play in the golden afternoon light, Hannah finally understood what he meant. They'd both been lost in different ways, her in poverty and desperation, him in loneliness and isolation. They'd found each other in the middle of nowhere, under an oak tree on a dying road, and they'd built something neither could have created alone. It hadn't been easy. It hadn't been perfect. But it had been real, and it had been theirs. That night after the children were finally asleep and the house was quiet, Hannah stood at the bedroom window looking out at the stars. Silas came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "What are you thinking about now?" he asked. Hannah leaned back against him, solid and warm and hers. "I'm thinking that if I could go back to that day under the oak tree and tell myself what was coming, the fear, the fights, the courtroom battles, all of it, I'd still make the same choice. I'd still get in that wagon because it led to this." "To this," Silas echoed and kissed the top of her head. They stood like that for a long time, two people who'd survived the worst and found the best, holding each other in the darkness and watching the stars wheel overhead. The same stars that had witnessed their first meeting, their desperate struggles, their hard-won victories. Outside, the ranch slept peacefully. The cattle in the pasture, the horses in the barn, the chickens in their coop, the garden that would need tending in the morning, the fences that would need mending, the children who would need breakfast. All the beautiful, ordinary work of living. And Hannah, who had once believed she'd lost everything, understood now that she'd actually found everything that mattered. Not wealth or status or the approval of people who didn't matter, but love that was tested and proven, family that was chosen and cherished, home that was earned through sweat and sacrifice and refusing to give up. She'd walked into the desert with nothing but her children and her stubborn will to survive. She'd walked out with a life worth living. And that, Hannah thought, as sleep finally pulled her under, was more than enough. It was everything.